And let me just confirm that we're live. Okay.
We're live. Okay, so welcome to the SLO County APCD, a meeting for May 27th, 2020. And I'd ask you to please rise for the flag salute. And I think, do you have a flag that you can throw up there? There we go. So you can do that. Or you got my flag in the window there. I pledge allegiance to the flag.
To the flag of the United States of America.
And to the republic for which it stands.
For which it stands.
One
nation, under God.
Under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. All right. We will do the roll call vote, please. Make sure we got everybody and we got quorum.
Chair Pashang, can we, before we take roll call, can we real quickly just cover the public participation options?
Yeah, so I'll do it. There are a number of public participation options that are available, and these are under Governor Newsom's Executive Order N2920 and the County of San Luis Obispo Emergency Service Director Shelter Home Order and the Board of Directors. So first one for public participation, this meeting is going to be conducted by Zoom. It requires a name and email to be entered prior to accessing the meeting. This is not a district requirement for participation. It is a Zoom requirement. Public participants are welcome to use an anonymous name, email if preferred. The meeting can be accessed as follows. Submit written comments via email to board clerk at slocleanair.org. Comments must be received as of yesterday at 1 p.m. yesterday. Any materials intended to be provided to the board during live public comment need to be received by the clerk of the board by 1 p.m. yesterday, May 26, 2020. You can also access it via teleconference by phone at 1-669-900-6833 and enter the meeting ID, which is 923-4448-6965. Via teleconference electronically at zoom.us, and it's J /92344486965, or on YouTube. You can live stream it on YouTube. So that is the public participation in today's meeting. And with that, we will go to a roll call vote, just to make sure we have established quorum.
Miss Arnold.
I'm here.
Miss Compton.
I'm here.
Miss Fonzie.
I saw her, so.
I can see her.
Do you have audio, Miss Fonzie?
Perhaps muted.
She's unmuted.
Perhaps Ms. Fonzie can raise her hand to show she's here.
Ms. Fonzie, Roberta, can you see us? Raise your hand if you can see us. Put your hand up. And we have an audio problem there, I believe.
Okay, let's come back to her. Mr. Gibson?
Here.
Mr. Hammond is absent. Ms. Harmon?
Present.
Mr. Hill is absent. Mr. Heading?
Present.
Mr. Paulding?
Here.
Mr. Pashang?
Yes, here.
Ms. Shaw?
Here.
Mr. Waggy?
Here.
So I think could we get one of the staff folks to call Ms. Fonzie and see if they can get her audio situation fixed? That would be great.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to move on to the consent agenda, which is items A1 through A9, and wanted to see if there is anybody that would like to pull any of those items for separate discussion today. And if you want to use the raise hand app to, if you've used that, the little button raise, you pull up the participants and then you can do raise hand, or you can, because I've got everybody not on you're on different screens, so it's tougher for me to see if you raise your hand. Okay, anybody would like to pull any of these items? All right, I've seen none. Is there a motion to?
Mr. Paulding has his hand up.
Okay, Mr. Paulding.
Thank you, Chair. I was looking for the raised hand icon and I wasn't able to locate it. I just had a note, a correction on item A2. Actually, item A1, our minutes from the January 22nd meeting. We had discussed contacting the Lucia Mar school district superintendent at that meeting in order to facilitate discussions about placing a monitor on site. And I had talked with Gary about that yesterday, that wasn't reflected in the record. And then we had also agendized for a future meeting a discussion regarding that. And so if Gary could just provide an update, there's been obviously turnover with the superintendent there. It may not be appropriate at this time to even need to agendize that discussion, but I wanted to correct that for the record and then have Gary provide an update, please.
Gary?
Yes, we have started monitoring at Dorothea Lange by placing one of our reference method monitors at a location above the school, co-located with an EBAM down below the school. So we've already started the monitoring ourselves without CMR's help. However, we would like to be able to, in the long term, actually place a monitor at the school just to get better readings. I'll go over a little bit of that in the APCO reports that's coming up next. So I'd be happy to put that on the agenda. Try to contact the CMR, the new superintendent there, and see how amenable he is to placing a unit temporarily, at least, at Dorothea Lange, so that we can get the numbers there. What we found so far is it looks like it's a little bit higher than Napoma Regional Park, but a lot lower than Mesa 2, which is its current reference monitor location. So we want to get that done. So I'll be contacting the CMR again here shortly. I know that they're kind of going crazy right now. So the schools are trying to figure out what they're doing. But in the interim, we are getting the data.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Jimmy, and I think this is going to be discussed, I think, in Gary's report coming up. So he'll probably bring it back up.
That sounds good to me. Thank you, Chair.
You got it. Any other comments on A1 through A9? Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
Mr. Hayden and Mr. Gibson. So
You need the public, Mr. Chairman?
Public comment.
We'll ask for public comment on consent items only. Seeing none, we'll close public comment. We do have a motion by Mr. Heading, Mayor Heading, and then Supervisor Gibson was the second. Any further discussion? Well, yeah, I think we have to do roll call votes on all of these. So
Yes, please.
Okay, ready for a roll call vote? The motion is to approve the consent agenda items A1 through A9 with including the corrections to item A1 as Mr. Paulding stated. Ms. Arnold.
Yes.
Ms. Compton. Ms. Compton.
Yes.
Ms. Fonzie. You're muted, Ms. Fonzie.
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Harmon.
Yes.
Mr. Paulding.
Yes.
Mr. Pashang.
yes.
Ms. Shaw.
Yes.
Mr. Wagi.
Yes.
Mr. Gibson.
Yes.
And Mr. Heading.
Yes.
The vote is unanimous.
Okay, we're going to move on to the public comment period. These are items that members of the public wishing to address the Air Pollution Control District Board on matters other than scheduled items that are on the agenda. So I will, first off, I think we've got a number of ways people could have delivered messages. So Were there any written comments, messages that need to be read that were received by yesterday at 1 p.m.?
We did not receive any written public comments or voicemails or any form of communication regarding this board meeting from any members of the public before or after the deadline. So we're good there. I did want to give the members of the public an opportunity to raise their hand. So if you're on the phone call, you're wanting to hit *9 to speak on items not on the agenda. And if you're on the webinar, there is the raise hand feature to speak on any items not on the agenda. And I don't see any hands at this time.
Let's wait a second here and just see. I'm looking at a number. There's 21 attendees that are on.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, so your last shot at public comment, if you would like to speak on items not on today's agenda. Okay, seeing none, we're going to close public comment and move on to the Air Pollution Control Officer's report. Gary. Are you there, Gary?
First, I'll start off with our COVID-19 response. District functions are 100%. We're not missing anything at this time. Our offices are closed unless you make an appointment. We were lucky that burn season had wound down by the time the virus struck, because that's majority of our in-office issues with people coming in is during burn season, with 1,000+ different burn permits issued and hundreds of them issued over the counter. We got through the burn season, so having a closed door appointment only is working fine. The majority of staff are telecommuting. Our electronic document system that we put in place a couple of years ago is functioning really well. Our inspectors already had tablet computers, and a lot of home staff had computers at home. And so we've got everybody up and running through our system. Stakeholder support, during this time, we've seen, some businesses that have issues with cash flow. So we're making accommodations, reasonable accommodations where we can. Budget issues, we currently we have really strong reserves. So we're very fortunate as compared to the municipalities and the county that rely on bed tax money and parking fees and other things that we aren't affected by. We do have some potential things, and I'll talk about that during the budget, but they're longer term and our reserves are substantial. Oceano Dunes update. I'll keep this brief. The SAG presentation awaits. So, the park shutdown effects that we've seen from it shutting down, we don't expect to see any significant changes in the emissions from that, because it's years of use of the dunes that has degraded the surface and the shape of it. It doesn't go back right away. In fact, there could be some things that we're doing initially right now with the foredune area that could have to cause a little bit more temporarily as the dunes form themselves into the shape that they're naturally going to take. We had some issues with sand removal and grading. They weren't really issues. They were practices that state parks has been doing for a long time, but during this COVID crisis, people picked it up that, look, it's shut down, but they're using the tractors to move sand. And primarily in front of the Strand houses there, where they actually have put in wind fencing every spring. And the weird thing about that is if they didn't do that, those houses would become foredunes, because that's where they built those houses. So it's really not something that they do somewhat to keep the entrance away, but also to keep the sands from encroaching on the neighbor's property. Dorothea Lange project, I talked about that earlier. We currently have one of our BAMs, which is a federal reference monitor, located on a house a little ways above Dorothea Lange, behind it, and a co-located electronic BAM called EBAM that we use for fires down below near the school. That unit allows us to use a battery and not to have electrical power. So we correlated the difference between the two. And we're doing a study right now to see what the Dorothea Lange emission levels are. And that will be reported out probably in September when we're done. I will also contact the new superintendent. Probably I'll wait until July or at that point so I can get through this current issues or hers, and try to get a BAM stationed on site for a couple of years so that we can really be sure and actually map the value and change our maps, because what we're finding is that preliminarily that Dorothea Lange is above NRP, Napomo Regional Park, which is impacted slightly from the dunes as compared right now. We're using in Mesa 2, which is heavily impacted. So right now, the concern is that we're telling the schools that their level of emissions are high when they're not nearly that high. So we want to get that straightened out so we can get the proper notifications about what they're breathing in that area. We're doing speciation sampling at a CDF site, and this is part of our stipulated order of abatement requirements that we look for other sources of pollution. So that's going on right now, a special study. We have monitors collecting samples that are being sent to labs to determine the components of the particulates caught, not just the pounds, the mass, but the actual speciation. So that way we can tell if it's coming from, if there's traces of nitrogen from ag or carbon from some other source. What we're seeing out there this year, in May, we have had a very windy May. So that is, that continues to be driving emissions. However, we saw that with the mitigations that we placed out there this year, it's kind of smoothed the high peaks down and actually shifted the maximum point of impact to our Mesa 2 site to the south. And so there's been a substantial reduction on our CDF site as compared to the Mesa 2 site, which hasn't seen a reduction. In fact, it's seen a little bit more this year, although the peak levels are lower and not as high as in the past. So we've flattened out, or we've smoothed out the emissions across the dunes, and now Mesa 2 appears to be the highest, mostly the highest point of impact. And that data will be looked at in the fall as well, and so we can get an idea of just where additional mitigations need to be placed. We have a hearing board item up in June, so we're recruiting for two hearing board members, an engineer and engineering alternate. That's open right now. I think it closes any minute. It closed this week, so there'll be that going on. Additionally, we'll have more positions in the fall that become vacant.
It closes on June 5th, Gary.
On the 25th?
On June 5th.
On June 5th, okay, so we got a little ways. The hearing board elections, I talked about that. The October 23rd hearing board meeting is our next update, where the hearing board will just hear an update of what's going on, kind of like what you're going to hear from the SAG today. They're going to get in depth to that in October with a public workshop type format. Well, we continue to have retirements, so I think we're going to have 3 this calendar year. One of them just happened, and expect 2 more in the fall. Recruitment is kind of weird right now with the COVID. It's a different response. So we're hoping that works out. We do have one of the positions is our tech and our air quality tech positions, and we do have somebody that's highly qualified that wants the job. He was around last year when we hired a new hire for moving up Carl, and he still wants the job. So we're fortunate with that one. We're going to get a really good replacement. And burn program update. This spring we've seen some pile burning and some control burns, but not as much as we had thought would occur. The winds have been tremendous, so it's really been hard to get some of them scheduled with the right kind of wind conditions. We were going to be burning the Cat Roberts this week, one of the bigger burns that we need to get done up there because of the live fire training activities that set it on fire. If we don't control it, it could come in a bad situation. So that is we'll try to get off next week, weather permitting. So I've been working with CAL FIRE and Monterey Bay area. And in July, we'll be taking a couple of rule changes to the board. These rule changes are, again, EPA generated wordsmithing rules that when you see what we have to change, you kind of shake your head. But I think EPA is looking for something to do. So they're looking over our rules and deciding they want to wordsmith some things. So we'll bring that to your board in June. And with that, that's all I have for the APCO's report. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Any questions?
If I might, Mr. Chair.
Certainly.
Gary, how many exceedances at CDF and Mesa 2 in May?
Let me grab that up here. There have been, let's see, from January to May 25th, there have been 24 at CDF and 22 at Mesa 2.
And if we were enforcing Rule 1001, how many violations of Rule 1001 would there have been?
I did not do that analysis, but if I were guessing, I would say, you know, probably 20 and 18. A few of them probably wouldn't have been.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind putting that together and circulating that to the board, please. That'd be interesting information.
Sure.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Any other questions for Gary?
Ms.
Yes.
Arnold has her hand up.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you. I couldn't tell if you could see that. Gary, I was just interested in the hearing board vacant position for an engineer and a alternate as well, correct? Is that what you said?
Yes.
So has that been noticed, or how has that been noticed? How does the public know that that's open?
Alyssa, do you want to explain the noticing procedures?
Yeah, we issued a press release and published a legal notice in the Tribune and also posted it to our website. We've sent several social media posts out about it as well. I believe that's all the notice that we have sent out. But yeah, press release, legal notice in the Tribune, and social media also on our website.
So have you had folks apply, or you?
We currently have both incumbents, both the engineer member and the engineer alternate, have submitted new applications. So they desire to continue in that position. This position requires them to be a certified PE engineer. So the requirements are a little bit more strict, kind of similar to the medical member position.
Okay.
So we do have 2 applicants, but we haven't received.
I was just worried we weren't getting anyone. And then my other question, I guess, is for Gary. Gary, you're talking about the exceedances since January, but I assume most of them were in April and May during the windy months. Those exceedances, and then Supervisor Gibson asked about Rule 1001, but the Dunes has been shut down to vehicles since what, March, end of March?
Yeah.
So these exceedances would have nothing much. I heard you in the beginning of your discussion sort of talking about, well, the dunes have been, you know, changes or whatever you said. I heard it to be no matter what, we're still going to assume some of this has to do with vehicles on the dunes, which I think is a little bit theorizing. But point is, we had some heavy winds and we had exceedances, correct? Am I getting all this right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Gary and his report? All right.
I have one question, John. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Gary, I just wanted to clarify that you said that the closure of the dunes had not had any measurable impact. Is that kind of the gist of what you just said there? I was expecting that to be a little bit different. I know it's still a short period of time overall, but been talking to some community members and they were wondering if it's had an impact.
You know, it's undoubtedly had some impact. The thing with the dunes, and as our dune geomorphologists, SAG members will be able to tell you, they'll answer this question a lot better than I would, but I'm basically giving you a secondhand from them, is that it takes many years for the sands to put themselves back into the shape that they would be at if vehicles didn't ride upon them. So, and the generation of the finer material, most of that comes from movement of sand, which comes from not having the right shape and structure there. So without those two things, you're basically looking at, not much possible change initially. And that's not to say that after a couple of windy seasons, there wouldn't be a significant change, that the shapes happen. But right now, that sand, initially while we're doing this, that sand may be moving more in some areas than it was before until it finds the shape, especially in the foredune area. And then Ian Walker will go over that in the SAG presentation about, how, what we did in different areas of the foredunes and how the height and topography have changed and how the plant lives grow and things like that. So it's really, really premature. We wouldn't expect to see significant reductions from just stopping riding for a few months. I mean, it's, again, it may be that 6 months may actually change the shape enough. We just don't know. It's a complex Mother Nature model that, it's gotta take time if you're going to do it sustainably. And, if you do try to force it into a different shape, you won't have a sustainable system, but you could get there quicker and it won't be a natural system. And they'll talk about that again. That's their expertise.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Mr. Gibson, Mr. Heading was the first, and then I'll go to Gibson.
Very good.
Mayor Heading.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment, Gary, I believe if my recollection is correct, pardon me, the SAG, you circulated a letter from the SAG about 2 pages or so long covering this in detail, and perhaps, if I'm correct, you could resubmit that to board members because I thought it was very helpful. And I know we'll have further comment today by the SAG, but I'll make reference to that if my recollection is correct.
Okay, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Willey, what I'm hearing you saying is that at this point, it's purely speculative to wonder what is happening as regards emissions for the short closure that we've had. The SAG letter is one thing, and I'll be interested in hearing from the SAG in the item upcoming. But that was the reason that I'm asking for an analysis of the Rule 1001 results, because as you will remember, that the basis of 1001 is to compare a natural sand field in front of the Ossaflaco to the disturbed one. So I think that would provide an interesting examination if we were actually to look at a few years of that. It would be in there, those kinds of situations that we might start to see some evidence. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You bet. Any additional questions for Gary? All right, seeing no hands raised up on the panel there, we're going to go to item B1, which is—
Mr. Chair, we do have public comment for the APCO's report.
We do? Okay, fire away.
Mr. Harris, Mr. Nick
Yes.
Harris, you're
Thank you
able to
for-
speak.
Thank you for taking my comment. I'm assuming you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we just heard this touched on a little bit. I have participated in a number of meetings. I'm with the American Motorcyclist Association, and I'm just kind of stunned that this closure is apparently just not a thing, and all the effects have already been, long-term. I'm curious how if there's data to back that up, or, I've never heard this claim. I've been to numerous meetings. I would assume that if this was an expected result, that we would have at least have heard about it. And so I'm curious how that assertion is being made. Is there another set of dunes somewhere that you've looked at? Is there any other way you've it just seems like a very sudden and significant change. I think everybody, including myself, expected to see changes in the air quality, and the fact that that has not occurred versus the previous year, it seems like a really major piece of information, and it just doesn't seem to be given the I guess the depth or the importance that I would have expected. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any further public comment?
We have public comment from Chris Sorensen. Chris, you may speak. There you go, Chris.
Just one minor point here. There seems to be some confusion about the effect of vehicles themselves riding on the dunes and the morphology and geology and vegetation on the dunes. The vehicles are not there, but the dunes are still there and they're still doing what they were doing. That needs to be clarified. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional public comment on the director's report? Okay.
I don't see any more public comment.
All right, we will close public comment on the APCO's report. And I don't think we have any additional discussion from the board. So if it's all right with everybody, we're going to move on to board business and item B1. Item B1. And Gary, am I turning this over to you?
You are. Thank you. So the fiscal year 2020 budget, the draft budget is being presented today. It's the first of 2 budget hearings. The second will be on June 24th. We've mailed notices to our stakeholders. We've published notices in the Tribune, placed copies in libraries, at our office and on the web. The budget itself is good. It's a very conservative approach. Let's say you want to hit the next slide. We're going to continue our cost-cutting and revenue enhancement measures that are adopted in the fiscal plan. Not too much revenue enhancement going on, except that's when we do grant programs with the state and we pick up admin fees from that. So that's pretty much our revenue enhancement measures right now. And over the last 3 years, we've managed to get quite a bit of additional grant monies, and that has allowed us to build up reserves to a very significant level, which I will show later in the slides. We've reduced employee costs and increased revenue. So our reserves are really in good shape compared to most. The revenue forecasts for next year, again, are conservative. We don't predict any significant revenue losses right now. That could change. We have significant exposure at the refinery. The refinery is about 18% of our budget. And so if that refinery did shut down, we would have a hole for that year. However, our reserves are capable of covering that for 3 or 4 years without doing any other revenue enhancements. We are asking for a change from a half-time clerical position to a full-time. We've done a lot of different changes around the district, and we're finding that that clerical position needs to be full-time to help us automate things and to free up time for my clerk, who I overly tax, and I owe her everything. So a little groveling here. We're maintaining our core and mandated air quality programs. So next slide. All right, notable expenditures. Salaries, benefits, and taxes decreased by $19,000, even though we're adding a half-time position. That is because changes to our budget have added monies to the staffing costs with the grant monies. So it's, our employee expenditures have been fairly flat. We've seen rising costs in employees, but we've reduced employees, lower level employees, used interns. We eliminated a couple of positions in the last 2 years, even though we're adding a half back, but at a much lower level. Maintenance of equipment increased a little bit. It's pretty low. Professional services, we're forecasting a decrease in that, 66,000. And then some changes to what we bought, we're buying less. So generally everything is going in the right direction. Next slide. And so here we can see the differences between the budgets. And if you look at salaries, we budgeted 347. We estimated almost 3.7 million. We estimated that this year will be close to 3.4, and we are requesting, again, slightly below what last year's budget was at 3.7. We will not spend that much. We never do. We always want to be very conservative in our approach. Service and supplies, they're essentially the same from the year before. We didn't do some things and didn't get some things, so they're down. This year's estimated there'll be extra money coming in. So all in all, we're seeing a budget decrease compared to the 2019-2020. And a lot of that money is grant monies that we got admin fees for, and we had to augment our budget. Our budget is really relatively flat, maybe slightly down, but just from the accounting measures of having to allocate the additional funding that we got, you have to balance the spreadsheets out, and that's what happens. And it ends up coming into an excess funding in the year, and it goes into reserves. And as far as the reserves go, we put $400,000 into reserves last year. This year, we're putting $60,000, which is the Diablo Canyon money, or $59,000, which is the Diablo Canyon offset money, and we're putting that into general reserves. Additionally, the excess funding that we get this year beyond what's budgeted is going to go into reserves as well. And we don't know that exact amount yet, but we do know that it's typically significant, and it wouldn't surprise me if another $100,000 or so go into reserves after it's all said and done. Next slide. And this is just a little pie chart showing our expenditures, and again, most of it is salaries and benefits, and services and supplies make up about 20%. So we don't do capital projects. So this is typical for us. And a lot of the services and supplies are things like legal fees, air quality consultants, things like that. Next slide, please. Then this is a little slide on where we spend the money that we collect. Planning and outreach, they're about 40%. Engineering and compliance, which is our permitting and compliance and fire stuff and a bunch of other stuff, makes up about half. And then fiscal admin and tech services, which is our monitoring group, they make up about 20% or so. Next slide. Okay, for this year, which will be out in our next packet, a little more information in June. What we're going to focus on as a district, again, Oceanic Dunes dust mitigation is a huge effort, and we'll be spending a lot of time with that. Holding a hearing board meeting on October 23rd, approving plans and reports, and so it takes a lot of time. And the monitoring that we do out there is there's no more monitoring. There's no monitoring anywhere that's that dense of high-tech monitors in the world. So our BAMs, our beta actuation monitors it's more saturated than any place else on Earth. So we're also going to be seeking the third year of the state's cap and trade funds. That's where we've built a lot of the reserves up by running these programs, utilizing interns, and then using the admin money to help build up our reserves. That money is going away, as with the state's budget prices. Those cap and trade funds, this year we may be able to secure some, and we're going as fast as we can for year 3, so that we can still, get the money for fireplaces, vehicle replacements, trucks, farm equipment, and such. That's going on right now. We hope to get that secured. We've fast-tracked everything that we can. We need to get it secured with the state and agreements in place so we can ensure that we get that funding. We're going to focus on wildfire health impact prevention with CAL FIRE, Fire Safe Council, and land managers. Again, we get into this COVID-19 timeframe, and people are concerned about, getting COVID-19. Well, fire season is here. We just had fire yesterday behind Cal Poly. We continue to work with CAL FIRE and Fire Safe Council and the land managers to ensure that they can get this burning done in a manner that has minimal impact. It's not going to have zero impact, but we are going to ensure that it's done in the best method possible. We're going to enhance our voluntary Don't Night Tonight program, again, during adverse burn conditions in the winter. We started using a next door program, and it seems to be getting a very good response to let people know about things like Don't Light Tonight. We haven't done that Don't Light Tonight campaign for bad burn days in the wintertime. Don't Light Tonight your fireplace, but we will be doing that in the fall. And we're hoping that sees a big bump, a big effective bump in the number of people who choose not to burn when they don't have to on bad air quality days. We're committed to enhancing our assistance with local jurisdictions to comply with the GHG regs. And this is a recent thing where we were going to go if the city or the county wanted to do an inventory and come up with their own requirements and their own levels. We were going to go into partnership with ourselves, Council of Governments, and the jurisdictions to fund it. And I told Andy Mutziger, our planning manager, that we should find the funding for the city's share at this point if they want to do it. It's it's optional, but if they determine they want to do it, we don't want to see that this thing that could make their CEQA process more streamlined. We don't want to see it go away because of these budget cuts that are coming with the municipalities. So we're committed to doing that, and we're lucky to have the funds available. Continue to work with CARB and EPA on pollution transport to the SLO County, and we're continuing to do that. That's going to be another couple of rules coming to you next month. That's why we get CMAQ money, transportation money for SLOCOG for our non-attainment areas, but that requires us to be in non-attainment and follow some arcane requirements to do things that don't make any difference other than giving us the money. We're going to work with our partners to support state and local federal strategies for clean air. And we do this through our CEQA review process. Next slide. Notable revenues. Our fund balance was estimated at $1 million. That's the carryover money that we don't spend on. It's on paper, it's not really real. Construction fees, we estimate that's going to go up by about $65,000. We had a very low estimate before. That's renewal and construction fees. That's just the growth of the permit system. We underestimated it the last time, and this is just an adjustment to get it up to what we've been getting. We don't forecast any significant closures at this time for any of our sources. State aid decreases by $248, and those are those admin fees for that grants program I talked to you about before. We don't count those in our budget unless we're sure they're going to come in. So that's forecasted as a decrease. It may be there, so we may have a lot more reserves for the following year. Use of reserves and designations decreased by $100,000. We moved some money around last time, so that's just an accounting blip. Again, with no proposed changes to permit fees or our hourly billing rate. I don't think that's going to be necessary for another year or so. So we're going to hold that steady. Next slide. And this is just the overall budget slide, as you can see. I won't go into details, but the large fees come in about $2 million from our permit system. Property taxes, $400,000. DMV fees, $1 million. State and federal aid, $280. Other district fees, mutual settlements. These sources of funding are fairly stable. The only thing that we could see is 1 year back in the recession. I think it was 2009 or 10. The state kind of held on to the DMV fees for a little while, but we eventually got them. So, and they weren't theirs, by the way. On the license plate on your registration, it'll say the money's the special districts, but they borrowed it for a while. I don't think they're going to do that this time. So that's a potential. We do have the reserves. As you can see down below, fund balances, reserves. The budget is balanced. Next slide. And again, this is just another of our revenue sources. You can see that the permit fee system is about 40%. DMV fees about 21%. Carryover money is about 20%. You know, property taxes are small, not small, 4,000, not small, but small compared to the whole budget. State and federal aid, not a lot. Mutual settlements is a small amount. Next slide. This is just a little bit of our healthy reserves. We've got a general reserve of $1 million, you know, $1,055,000. And then we've got a bunch of other designations for reserves that we'll continue to build. 2.4 million will allow us to weather a number of years with substantial revenue losses. So we're in great shape. We're very fortunate and very conservative in what we've been doing, trying to prepare for a rainy day fund. And again, we've been preparing for something to happen to that refinery for quite some time. We're in a good spot should anything happen. Next slide. And this is just a graph of what we've done with the reserves, about increasing it from 1.75 to almost 2.5 million over the past 3 years. And I do believe that that number is going to, you know, it's going to trend up. It's going to actually, you know, we'll probably have close to 2.4 million, I would guess, or 2.5 this time next year. Next slide. Okay, so we recommend that you consider this information in public comment, and you can provide me with any directions to recommended changes. And again, we'll bring back the final budget for your consideration on June 24th.
Okay.
That's all I have.
Thank you, Gary. Are there any questions from the board?
Mr. Heading has his hand up, and Ms. Compton has a question as well.
We'll go Mayor Heading first, and then Ms. Compton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gary, thank you as always for a very comprehensive and complete budget presentation. I very much appreciate that. If I could refer you to page B18 in your report, your income statement, basically. I note 2 specific areas: operating and authority to construct permits for about $1,982,000, and then other district fees about 226 or 227,000. If I add those together, I get about $2.2 million, which is 43% of your operating revenue. I'll refer you back to page B11 in your report. The very last paragraph, last sentence, there are no proposed changes to the district's fees, hourly billing rate, or permit renewal factor. I have 3 questions. 1, when's the last time we've updated fees? 2, are we on a cost recovery method of determining what our fees are? And my last question is, if so, why are we not including a CPI accelerator in our fees, and or doing a master fee schedule study to look at revenue opportunities? Thank you.
Kevin, do you want to answer the first? Is Kevin here?
Yes, I'm sorry. The first question was talking about the increase in
the
thanks. District fees, but that sentence seems to say the opposite.
When was the last time we raised fees?
I thought I
2016.
That sounds about right. It's been 4 or 5 years since the last increase.
Okay, and are we using a cost recovery method similar to what cities do in terms of fee assessment?
We do a cost recovery assessment. We have been in the range of about, I think it's about 85% right now. We have goals to be 95%. We've had other revenue sources available to not increase those. So we are not recovering our total permit fee structure cost right now. And, you know, we had considered doing something this year, and then COVID-19 hit, and we thought it would not be a great idea given that we're in a fairly solid financial position.
Well, I'll just add the comment that since it makes up 43% or so in my rough calculation of our revenues, and we haven't increased fees since 2016, perhaps staff might consider looking at either a master fee schedule study and or including some kind of CPI accelerator in to improve our revenue picture.
Okay.
I hear you. And then we're definitely watching that through our fiscal planning. We could bring something back to this board next budget cycle. This budget cycle, I don't believe, you know, raising fees right now would be a good idea given our reserves. But yes, I don't like to see the reserves being whittled down when the program's not paying for itself.
Thank you, Gary. Ms. Compton.
Am I unmuted?
No, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So I wasn't going to comment on the previous comment, and I have a question, but I will comment on that. I think raising fees right now would be a horrible idea with the state of our businesses in California and what has happened due to no fault of their own. So I think that's a terrible idea. But I guess when it comes back to the board, I can voice my opinion there. My question was on page B14. And you state that property taxes, and this is just a small portion of the budget, but you state property taxes are budgeted to increase due to property additions and increases in valuation by the assessor. Was that done pre-COVID or post-COVID? Because I'm having a hard time understanding how those will increase, and maybe there's some property additions I don't know about. So I just would like a little bit more explanation of that and why you're expecting them to increase.
I can tell you that it was done pre-COVID, but we don't know forecasting what's going to go on with that. It's not a huge difference in revenue. And you know,
I get that. I just wondered if it was so.
Yeah, but what we're having right now, we have a construction boom, especially in San Luis Obispo. So even the loss of value, I think we're going to, you know, make up for it if they continue to build those thousands of houses around San Luis Obispo. I'm not sure what's going on. The Chirpaso has some building going on right now, but San Luis Obispo is a crazy number of housing projects.
So what do you mean by property additions? Do you mean the new housing projects, or do you mean the APCD is acquiring new properties?
No, the new housing projects.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, the Delidio, Avila Ranch, San Luis Ranch, Avila Ranch, Forgetti Ranch.
Okay, got it.
They're
Thank you.
going crazy.
Okay, anybody else would like to ask questions from the board? All right, we're going to go to public comment, and this is public comment on this item only, not any other item. So we will be going, I think it's Jared McLeod. Could you open him up?
Mr. McLeod, you can speak.
There we go. Sorry, my public comment got passed up on the last one, but it's really brief. So I'll just go really quick here. My name is Jared McLeod. I am with California Off-Road Vehicle Association, Corba. At the December 2019 APCD hearing in SLO, the APCD ordered the closure of 48 acres of prime beach.
Jared, we're going to have another item. This is on the budget. Is your comments on the budget?
No, it was actually on the last section, but it got skipped over.
Okay, so we're gonna be coming up here with a presentation by the Scientific Advisory Group, and I think your comments would probably fit better there.
Perfect.
So if you could just hang on for a minute, and we'll get to that item, and then you will have public comment. Okay.
Thank you.
Any discussion on B1, which is the hearing on the fiscal year 2020-2021 district budget? Okay. And we'll bring it, we'll close public comment on that item, and we'll bring it back for discussion from the board. And or a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if we need a motion. This is Bruce. I think the budget seems well crafted, prudent. Glad to see reserves being protected and enhanced. And the item says direction, so go forth and prepare a final budget would be my thought.
Okay. Any other further discussion?
And this is Ed Waggy. I agree with Bruce. I think the budget was well crafted in these trying times, and I think what we're doing right now is fine. And as far as any fee increases, I think that should wait until next year. Thank you.
Okay. Further discussion? All right. Then we will close this item.
Sorry, Chairman Pashong, I can see that John Heading has his hand raised.
There he is.
Yep. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. I would concur with Mayor Waggy's statement with regard to consideration for looking at fees next year. This may not be the year for it. I just wanted to point out that this is one of the issues that gets public entities, especially cities and other municipalities, into trouble when we do not keep up with fees and assessments. And I would appreciate consideration for looking at that in the next year or so. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else want to raise their hand and discuss the B1, the budget? All right. We're going to then close this item and move on to the next item, which is C1. And Gary, I believe this is a recognition of 30 years of service for Mark Elliott. So take it away, Gary.
Okay. Mark and I started roughly about the same time 30 years ago. He's been just a tremendous asset for the district. He's worked with Fire Safe Council really well. He works with the public extremely well. He mentors our younger staff. It's a really big hole to fill. We're going to miss him, but he's put his time in and done a great job. And if the board chair would like to read the resolution for Mark.
Certainly. This is a resolution honoring air quality specialist Mark Elliott for 30 years of service as an employee of the San Luis Obispo County Air Pollution Control District. Whereas Mark F. Elliott has served in an exemplary and distinguished manner for 30 years at the San Luis Obispo County Air Pollution Control District, devoted to the protection of clean air and public health. And whereas during his tenure at the district, Mark served as the Air Quality Specialist, AQS, in the Engineering and Compliance Division as an inspector. Mark was hired as an AQS 1 and quickly moved up through AQS series to AQS 3, initiating and improving many of its core programs. These include, but are not limited to, the district's open burning program, refinery inspection and compliance protocols, asbestos program, public and business outreach, endeavors regarding permit renewal and complaint complaint inspections. And whereas Mark was the lead inspector of the Santa Maria Finery, district representative of the San Luis Obispo Community Fire Safe Council, one of the founding staff members for the district's team building and spirit teams, and school outreach persona, Professor O Zone. Mark's innovative approaches to key district programs, elements such as asbestos and burning, have contributed to the success of these programs today. And whereas Mark has worked closely with many local, regional, and state agencies and organizations such as CAL FIRE and Region 4 Asbestos Task Force over the years of the development and the implementation of numerous important programs and projects of regional significance. And whereas Mark has been an outstanding and dedicated leader of his colleagues with talent, motivation, work ethic, and commitment to the district's mission that will be hard, if not impossible, to replace. And whereas if not visiting family or playing with his grandkids, Mark can likely be found in the garden, on a hiking trail, or heading down the road less traveled. Therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the San Luis Obispo County Air Pollution Control District do hereby recognize Mark F. Elliott for his 30 years of dedicated and distinguished service at the San Luis Obispo County Air Pollution Control District, and expresses its appreciation through this resolution presented this 27th day of May 2020. Congratulations, Mark. Mark, would you like to say something?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
We sure can.
All right. thank you, everyone, for the kind words. And one of the things that I've learned over the past several months of COVID-19 sheltering in place has been to be grateful for all the things that we do have. And I'm very thankful and feel very lucky to have spent 30 years with the APCD. I feel like I've been a small part of a big mission because air quality is pretty darn important to our county and our state and our world. We have a big challenge here, I think, to let our community understand that our air quality, yes, it's good, but if we don't protect it, it's going to degrade. Air quality is very complicated issue, and it's all the little choices in all of our lives that affect kind of the outcome of the air quality that we'll have. So I feel like the district wouldn't be where we are today and to have the good air quality we have had it not been for Bob Carr, who led the team for nearly 30 years. And he made choices to help direct us in building partnerships with the community. I think the community respects our agency. It's probably one of the most respected air districts in the state. And I feel proud to be part of that. I think Bob, he listened to people because he cared about them. And after Bob retired, Larry Allen and now Gary Willie, they both have very similar leadership styles. And I think they're going to continue that mode. And I think we're going to have a good future ahead of us. With that, I know we'll have a good future because of some of the younger people. Notice I said younger than me, because these younger people in our office, they are so sharp, they're so positive, they're so motivated, and they're so darn good with technology, having helped me so many times. Thank you, Sarah. That I feel like, you know, my retirement, the district's in very good hands. It will be for a long time. I would be remiss in if I didn't say something about who really holds our staff really together. And that's our admin staff. From the day one when I started till now, they really help us, and they make us look way better than maybe we really are, or some of us are. Speaking for myself, they really hold our teams together and make us look good. I've said this before many times, but I wouldn't have been able to last as long as I have at the district were it not for such a professional and fun-loving team of coworkers, agency people, and permit holders, and of course the public. I did a lot of complaint responses, and the complaints run the gamut, but being out there with the public and trying to, you know, be of service to people is really important. My biggest thing I think that held me together in all these years is my friend and colleague, Tim Fuse, who has been my mentor, my coach, my partner, and we've had a lot of fun together. Makes it fun to come to work every day. And now for the last year or two, I forget, he was promoted to my supervisor. So that sure helped the last few years go a lot smoother for me. And the last thing I want to leave people with is a quote from one of my heroes, Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. I think if we follow his example and his words, that the world will be a lot better. And of course, he said, there's 3 ways to ultimate success in life. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind. So I will miss you all, and but I will come to visit. And thank you so much for this honor and resolution.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well said. Any questions from the board?
I have a comment, John. It's Debbie. I can't tell if it shows my little hand raising, but I just wanted to say thank you to Mark for all the years. I've enjoyed working with them, and especially Mark, your time at Fire Safe Council, which I think it's another place that you did a lot of good work, and were such a big influence to the county. So anyway, I wish you a very happy retirement and appreciate all you've done.
Thank you.
Mayor Waggy?
I want to echo what Debbie just said. I first got on the Fire Safe Council in 2004 for a year, and then came back about 12 years ago. Mark was there then. He's been a great asset to try to help us keep air quality clean in the midst of having to have controlled burns and other means of taking care of vegetation. But Mark has always been very professional, easy to work with, just a real solid individual. We're really going to miss you. I can tell you're really going to enjoy retirement, but big shoes to fill. But I know you have an successor on the council who will also do a good job. So again, thank you very much, Mark.
Great.
Thank you.
Any additional public comment? Okay, is there any public comment from outside the board? Seeing none?
I do not see any.
Okay, we'll close public comment. I do believe, do we need to do a motion and a vote on this? Looking here to approve the resolution. Is there a motion to approve the resolution?
This is Ed Waggy. I so move.
Second.
And
Mayor Heading.
Mayor Heading.
Mayor Heading, yes. Thank you.
So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Okay, we'll do a roll call vote on this one.
Miss Arnold?
Yes.
Miss Compton? Miss Compton?
Yes.
Thank you. Miss Fonzie?
Yes.
Mr. Gibson?
Yes.
Miss Harmon is now absent. Oh, is she still here? She is gone now. Mr. Paulding?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Pashang?
Yes.
Miss Shaw?
Yes.
Mr. Heading?
Yes.
Mr. Waggy?
Yes.
The vote is unanimous.
Great. Congratulations, Mark. Thank you very much for your service. Okay, we're now moving on to item C2. And C2 is the Scientific Advisory Group presentation on the Oceana Dunes mitigation efforts. And Gary, I'll turn it over to you to do the intro.
Okay, we're lucky today to have 2 esteemed professors in dune geomorphology. We have Dr. Ian Walker and Dr. Raleigh Martin, and they're going to talk about what's being done out there and what's going to be done out there, and about how this the system works. So I'll now let, I guess Ian's going to take over first. Let Ian come. So Ian Walker.
If I could push my screen, it'll allow me to use the mouse and indicate a few things during the talk, and it'll allow me to advance for Raleigh. Is that possible?
I'm sure we can make it possible.
I'm sorry, Ian, what were you asking me to do?
If I could share my screen, I'll show the same presentation, but it allows me to indicate things with my cursor and control.
Oh, sure. Let's see here.
If it's a hassle, I'll just go with the PDF.
Let's see here. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think because we have it configured not to have anybody else share, I'm not sure that I can allow you to share your screen.
That's fine. We'll just roll with this. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the APCD board, members of the public. On behalf of the Scientific Advisory Group, I'll be presenting an update on progress in the past year or so. The way the presentation will work is I'll start out with a general overview of progress to date, as well as some of the monitoring and mitigation efforts underway. And then I'll pass it over to Dr. Raleigh Martin, who will talk about the modeling and next steps as we go. Next slide, please.
Ian, does it allow you to advance the slides on your own? You should have remote control.
No, it doesn't, sorry.
There you go.
Thank you. So in terms of progress over the past year and a bit, these are the key achievements. Several meetings with various permutations of our SAG group and CalParks Off-Road Vehicle Division and the APCD. Of course, the PMRP was revised about this time last year, and we developed the first annual report and work plan, not without some growing pains, but please keep in mind this was the first work plan developed after revising the PMRP. This was followed by the APCD hearing in November of 2019, which led to another update of the stipulated order of abatement. An OHV commission meeting was held in December of 2019 that the SAG participated in, and the 2020 annual report and work plan was completed recently. All to result in really significant mitigation efforts that have been put into place in this last year. We'll talk more about those, with more than 90 acres of surface stabilized or restored, including the 48-acre fording. The monitoring efforts to both quantify dust emissions from the surface using the PI swirl testing, as well as the air quality stations, have been expanded now to 21 meteorology and air quality stations within the park itself. And as Gary notes, this is among and probably the most instrumented dune field on the planet at the moment. We've added a device inside the park that measures upper atmosphere data, which serves the modeling efforts, which we'll talk about later. And we have on-the-ground sediment traps measuring what is actually moving through the treatment areas. And we are conducting landscape scale assessments of land surface change using drones. Currently, we're working on refining the dust emissions modeling, which is conducted by the Desert Research Institute, or DRI. We're feeding in new emissions grids. So these are the maps derived from the PI swirl testing into that's underway currently, and very shortly we'll be putting in the local upper air data and turbulence data to refine the model. And of course, the March 2020 closure of the riding area due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I will read from our letter that we published that was alluded to earlier, just to clarify our statement and perspective on what that closure means in terms of broader scale geologic processes. I'll actually read from that now. This is a segment, the latter portion of the letter. It's available on the APCD website. It's our position as the Scientific Advisory Group, which consists of dune geomorphologists, aeolian or windblown sand transport experts, and dust emission specialists, that regardless of OHV activity, PM10 emissions will continue at the ODSVRA whenever natural windblown sand processes are active. This is a long-term natural geologic process. You'd be hard-pressed to find sand surfaces acted upon by wind that don't emit dust. As can be seen at the analog dune locations within the park that have experienced minimal OHV impacts, such as the Oso Flaco section of the park, the emission of PM10 dust is a feature of natural dune landscapes subjected to strong winds. But the current state of the landscape within the riding areas of ODSBRA has been altered by decades of disturbance. As such, the extent of dust emitting sand surfaces and perhaps the availability of dust-sized grains for emission is greater today than it was decades ago. Multiple measurement campaigns have revealed that the dune areas that are subjected to the most intensive OHV activity also produce the highest PM10 dust emissions. So this refers back to the pi swirl testing I was mentioning earlier. In contrast, undisturbed locations like Oso Flaco tend to emit less PM dust. In short, enhanced PM emissions will continue in the OHV disturbed sections of the ODSBRA, even in the absence of OHV activity. The time required for the dust emissions from the dune sand to reach levels similar to those prior to large-scale OHV activity remains unknown. But what I can tell you is that geologic processes like this act on long time scales, but within those are embedded small time scales that range from hours on a day of a typical wind event that we see in the spring, to decades for dune systems to evolve in response to restoration or vegetation change, to centuries or thousands of years in terms of the presence and movement of sand to create these broader dune systems. And as Gary mentioned earlier, it's a very complex system, and to be tinkering with components of it takes time. The dunes, sediments, and vegetation will each require their times to reestablish to a new lower regime of disturbance. This could be on the order of years to decades left to nature's devices. Relative to these natural timescales of adjustment, a few weeks or months of temporary OHV restrictions may not be sufficient to result in substantial declines in PM emissions. The dune and beach system is disturbed, and it will take time to recover. This is precisely why the SAG has been engaged with parks to pursue environmental restoration activities to accelerate the transition of certain sections of the ODSBRA to conditions that have lower dust emission potential. This involves both modifying the wind field that exerts the stress that creates and lifts the dust, as well as stabilizing the surfaces themselves to reduce the emergence of dust-sized particles. So even so, this environmental restoration process takes years for implementation and for vegetation plantings to grow to maturity. I'll also note here that underway since the closure has been a new campaign of pi swirl testing, which will capture the surface behavior without recent vehicle disturbance, and our increased monitoring campaigns, which I'll refer to in the rest of the slide deck here. Next slide, please. So the map on the right here shows various areas of treatment that have occurred recently. We have, of course, the new 48-acre foredune treatment areas that consist of 6 different treatment types, which I'll talk about in a moment. 40 acres of seasonal wind fence and another 4.4 of permanent treatment. A total installation of close to 90,000 plants and 677 pounds of native seed into these treatment areas. The monitoring network has increased, as I mentioned earlier, to 21 meteorological stations, 6 of which exist in the new foredune treatment areas and 15 elsewhere in the park. An installed BAM instrument within the dune field itself to assess on-site dust measurements, and completion of the pi swirl testing, both in 2019 and the recent campaign of 2020. As Gary alluded to earlier, there are other studies underway to assess the sources and components of the dust that we capture in the air quality monitoring stations. So those studies should provide some new information there. And focused research to assess the impacts on dust levels since the COVID-19 closure, which I'll speak a little more about. Next slide, please. Just a few shots here of recent mitigation monitoring efforts. We can see the large barbecue flats restoration area of about 27 acres, and thanks to Ronnie Glick and other park staff for providing these images. In the center, in the bottom middle, we've got the Bigfoot project, which was expanded by 35.2 from the paw print restoration area. The bottom left is the SODAR instrument. So this is an instrument that profiles wind speed and turbulence from about 30 meters to about 200 meters or so in the atmosphere, which again is pretty imperative for improving our modeling efforts. To date, we've been using the Vandenberg Airport upper air data, which is in very different terrain. The bottom right, we see one of the 21 different monitoring stations, very well instrumented to provide everything from wind conditions to dust emissions. And then in the top right, some of the planting campaigns that occurred in February within the new Fording. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of the Fording restoration, for those of you who haven't been on site, you can see on the left, the map here shows 6 different treatments. So we've got 1A and 1B. These are essentially control sites wherein the area has been fenced and left to nature's devices, helped only by the introduction of natural seed. I'll talk about something called sheep's footing for those of you who aren't familiar with that. It's a large roller that essentially dimples the surface, and the decision was made there to help with water collection and seed collection by texturing the surface essentially, but otherwise left to nature's own devices. Treatment area 2 includes some native seed and sterile grass, also with a sheep's foot treatment. So we're adding a sterile grass to kind of increase roughness and reduce sand transport in those areas with the native seeds. Treatments 3 and 4 on the map here, which are actually treatments 4 and 5, are node planting. And you can see in the top left, or the pictures on the right, sorry, these large circles. The bottom right here shows one of these straw circles. They're about 12 feet in radius. In the middle, we have 9 plants. You can sort of see in the middle of that cluster, these plants that were introduced. These are all native plants, 14 species that can handle the disturbance. And then in the top right, you can see the 2 different types of treatments. So a lower density spacing and a higher density spacing, and then off in the distance, what we call the Parks Classic, which is broadcast straw and seedlings and seed planting. So you might wonder why the nodes. Well, if you go down to the Oso Flaco site, you'll notice that the terrain is quite hummocky. That's the natural state of the system. And those hummocks are initiated by small clusters of plants which start to promote sedimentation. And then through feedback, that sedimentation grows into a mound that's stabilized and anchored by the vegetation. So we took the average spacing of those types of nodes down at Oso Flaco and randomly propagated those through the surface here, which is why they look a little disarrayed, but that's intentional. These nodes won't stay. We will lose some, we will gain some, but we're kickstarting the system by protecting the plants with the straw, facilitating sediment deposition because we know the onshore sand transport is very high, and then the system will reorganize. So the question will be, which of these treatments then reorganizes in a way that starts to provide the reductions in sand transport and mitigation benefits. Next slide, please. You may have seen this orange thing flying in the sky if you were out in October or February. This is our drone system, our unmanned aerial system. It has a high resolution camera. We can program it with an iPad, and it basically flies back and forth in the sky and takes thousands of pictures that we then use to create a digital elevation model. So we get a couple things from that, a very high resolution picture, which you see on the right here. I know it doesn't do it justice on your well, it depends on your screen, I suppose, but about half an inch of resolution. So it allows us to zoom in on the surface. We can count plants. We can estimate how much sediment has been deposited. And from these overlapping photos, we can then create a 3-dimensional model of the surface. And then over time, we can compare those models, and I'll show you what that looks like, to determine, for example, when we put in these restoration treatments, how effective they are at trapping sand and creating a mitigation effect. We can also determine, once we implement a treatment, how that impacts the sand transport pathways. Remember, every single grain of sand is emitting dozens or more of dust particles. So part of the strategy here is reducing windblown sand transport that in turn contributes to the dust emissions. And as we do this over time, we will then look back on the implemented treatments and reassess those through an adaptive management process. Next slide, please. So here is an example of our map from February. It has an odd shape for a variety of reasons. We have private land holdings. We have long inland sand transport pathways that direct toward areas, for example, like CDF, which explains the long peninsula in the middle. We want to know, what is the effect of upwind treatments on sand movements and dust emissions in that direction. We've extended it all the way down to the north end of Oso Flaco, you see there on the far bottom right, where our natural dunes exist. And we have the plover exclosure, which is just to the right or south of the 4 dune restoration zone shown here in right. So if you were to zoom in on this, you would be able to see individual footprints, crabs, you name it, garbage, all those sorts of things. And we can quantify anything from plants to sand movements and ripple patterns from this type of data. Next slide, please. This is just a zoom in on the 4 dune restoration zone with the 6 different treatments. To the left or north, we see the control treatments with sheep's foot only and a variety of different seedling and sterile grass treatments. The nodes in 4 and 5, and this was taken just in the middle of the implementation of the straw circles. So you can see in 4 that low density node network has been completed. They're just starting on 5. And they're about halfway through treatment 6, which is the Parks Classic broadcast straw. All of these treatments are designed to capture sand. We know that there is a huge amount of sand coming inland and being blown onshore by competent winds. The dust emission problem at the Oceano Dunes is an upwind problem. And what I mean by that is every sand grain coming in from the ocean has the ability to be emitting several dozens of or more of dust-sized particles. So what we're doing here with the 4 dune is we're introducing roughness that trips up the boundary layer, which essentially means the portion of the atmosphere that is moving quickly near the surface that creates what we call a shear stress to move those sand grains. So there's a 2-pronged approach here. We're altering the wind field. We're reducing shear stress that emits the dust and sand particles, but we're also creating what we call a sink or a store for sediment. So this wide feature acts over time, like you see in the Oso Flaco dunes, to capture sediment. Every grain captured is 1 less grain that is emitting dust downwind. These 4 dunes serve many different functions. We call them ecosystem services. And this is one of those services. It provides, of course, habitat and other things, but it also provides a trap for sediment. And it will take time to develop that trap. Next slide, please. This might look a little psychedelic, so let me walk you through this here. This is the same area blown out a little bit. You can see the treatment polygons identified by number in the bottom, and some blue and red colors. This map is derived from the 2 points in time. So we had our October map and our February map. What we're doing here is we're getting a baseline assessment for how much sediment is moving through the system prior to the restoration. Remember, the restoration was put in place in February, just as we were flying, so it had no impact on the system. The red colors here indicate erosion. So if you see red colors or red pixels, those are areas that between October and February lost sediment, and the blue areas represent areas that gained sediment. For those of you who enjoy the dunes, you know that these dunes move quite a bit. They'll move every wind event. They're very mobile. They move on average of about 70 centimeters per year, or sorry, 70 centimeters per month. They're quite mobile. And that's what we see in these blue bands here. These represent the slip faces and crests of the big dunes in behind the 4 dune. Areas that don't have color don't demonstrate any significant change in elevation. So they're neither capturing or losing sediment. And what you'll see in treatment areas 4, 5, and 6 is that area has a higher proportion of relatively stable surface. That doesn't mean that sand is not moving there. Sand is bypassing through actually quite a huge amount of sand, but it's neither raising or lowering the surface. Now that's not to say that surface changes don't occur in those treatments. You can see some blue and red areas. Areas 1, 2, and 3 are more dynamic. And what I mean by that is there's more sediment both accumulating and being eroded from that area. This is a function of the natural variability in these systems. So we now know going into the restoration process, the treatment areas 1, 2, and 3 are a little more dynamic. 4, 5, and 6 are a little less dynamic. Lots of sand moving through nonetheless. You can also see in the bottom center of the photo, there's some sort of wavy blue patterns there. These are large bars or berms actually that develop on the upper beach. You've seen this, of course, if you've driven the beach through the seasons. And that's a flux of sediment that's coming in and that will be blown on shore during this wind season. And we'll see that in the following slides that as of May this year, we've seen quite a bit of wind and quite a bit of sediment moving through the foredune treatment. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're looking at some aerial images taken facing onshore from Ronnie Glick and his crew in Cal Parks. To the left, you see one of the washroom facilities, and the yellow lines here represent the boundaries between the different treatments. Now, you're not seeing much here aside from blown sand, not surprising. You can see the boundary fence in the bottom, but these first two areas here are sheepsfoot only. So they were dimpled and seeds were added to the areas, at least to area 2. Next slide, please. On the ground, though, we are starting to see some germination. So in the area 2 where native seed was introduced, we are seeing seedlings start to emerge. With treatment area 1, the approach there, the hypothesis there was that let's just leave the system as is done seasonally in the plover exposure to see what emerges on its own. Is there a seed bank present? If so, what pops up and how vigorous can these plants reestablish? Again, this is very, very early. We're not even through the first phase of the growth season, but it's encouraging to see that we are getting some plant material start to develop. Next slide, please. This is treatment area 3. So we had native seed with the sterile wheat ryegrass seed and plus sheep's footing. So again, you don't see much here at this perspective. Next slide, please. But on the ground, you can see some of the wheat and ryegrass. Some of this is stubble. It did germinate, but then we had a dry spell. But that stubble, as you can see, is providing some sediment trapping, which is leading to really small scale dunes and roughness. And within the roughness areas, we're getting other seedlings that are establishing. So this treatment seems to be doing well. Again, it might not look impressive yet. These processes take time, but this is one step in accelerating it. Next slide, please. This is the low density node. So this was taken May 8th. If you look carefully, depending on your monitor, you'll be able to see some of the circles. They're all covered in sand, not surprising, and that was expected. But the circles, again, are accumulating a bit more sand than the areas around. Why didn't we broadcast here? Well, the natural dune systems have what we call streets or blowouts in them that allow the landward movement of sand and nutrients and seeds and so on to create their form. So the idea with the odd spacing here is that the system will reorganize from these random nodes toward kind of its natural form in a more accelerated way. Next slide, please. Similarly with area 5, we're looking offshore here. You can see a few of the circles that haven't been covered yet by sand in the lower center of the photo. It won't take time for those. It won't take much time for those to be covered. So again, these are trapping sediment, but there is still sediment bypassing of the system, as you can see here. Next slide, please. So this is the type of response that we're seeing in these clustered node treatment areas. You can see a nice cluster of natural plants. These were planted as seedlings, and we're starting to get some appreciable deposition around those. So these are those small hummocks that start to develop. You've seen them if you've been down in the plover exposure when it's opened up. And through time, they'll grow fairly quickly as long as the plant cover remains. The plants are adapted to disturbance and sedimentation. This is why they have sort of evolved in the foredune area. So we've been very selective in the types of plants that are used to promote this kind of response. Next slide, please. And this is treatment area 6. Now, the first thing you notice here is that the whole area isn't inundated with sand. That's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It just means that that surface is rougher than the node surfaces, And we do have some alongshore variation in the onshore supply of sediment, as you saw in those bars that had welded to the beach. So within this treatment, again, we've got full straw cover and plantings of seedlings. Next slide, please. And this is what we see. Not that dissimilar from what we saw in treatment area 3. We've got some clusters of the ryegrass, some of which is dead. We've got a few more established seedlings taking place here. So this is, all of these are, again, they might not look that impressive to some of you, but this is very encouraging that even despite the dry phase and the very strong winds that we had this spring, we have good plant establishment happening. Next slide, please. So I'll just finish up my section here with a few slides to give credit to an incredible amount of work that's happened in the last year, in the last few months in particular. We've got Mike Bush and his team at Cal Poly. You can see some of the students at work here, preparing the seeds, planting, growing tons of seedlings. Ronnie Glick and his crew doing the same in their Cal Parks facility. We've got the California Conservation Corps and other planting crews. An incredible amount of work has gone in. And based on my experience, there's no other dune restoration effort of this scale ongoing, certainly in North America, but not that I'm aware of anywhere else in the world. So this is kind of a monumental effort right now, and it will take time to see some results, but it's encouraging so far. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Raleigh Martin to talk a little bit more about the modeling.
Thank you, Ian. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. So first, I also wanted to thank the APCD board for inviting the SAG to present at today's meeting, and to thank the entire SAG, as well as Cal Parks and the APCD for their contributions to the work that we're presenting today. So now I'm going to talk about the dust model that informs much of the work for the Oceano Dunes Dust Mitigation Project. But before I get into this model, I think it's useful to first look at the Stipulated Order of Abatement, or SOA for short, which provides a motivating rationale for use of the dust emissions model I'm going to present. So the underlying goal of the SOA is to drive management actions at Oceano Dunes to reduce ambient PM10 dust concentrations at downwind locations, including at the CDF monitoring station. The federal PM10 standard for a 24-hour period is 150 micrograms per cubic meter, and the California standard is 50 micrograms per cubic meter. The primary way to evaluate progress toward these targets is through examination of observed PM10 values at CDF and other monitoring stations. However, because of meteorological variability, it is difficult to directly judge the impact of specific Oceano Dunes mitigation actions on the downwind PM10 dust concentrations. Therefore, the SOA also specifies an initial target based on PM10 mass emissions instead of concentration. And so the mass emissions are the physical mass of PM10 dust that is emitted from the ODSVRA during a 24-hour period. And so therefore, this is measured as metric tons per day instead of micrograms per cubic meter. So compared to dust concentration, mass emissions gives a more direct measure of the impact of Oceano Dunes management actions on air quality. However, it is impossible to directly measure the total mass emissions of PM10 dust from Oceano Dunes. Therefore, the SOA calls for use of a model from the California Air Resources Board, or alternatively, another model as agreed to by the SAG. So in consultation with Parks, SAG agreed to use a model created by DRI, which Ian briefly mentioned earlier. This SOA further specifies there should be the use of a baseline scenario based on the 10 most emissive days in the 2013 windy season, which was prior to most of the mitigation action. And so based on modeling this consistent scenario of 10 baseline days, this can inform an apples to apples comparison of different possible restoration actions. Next slide, please. So the DRI dust emissions model is composed of 3 parts, which are illustrated by the figures shown here, which are taken from the draft particulate matter reduction plan. First, on the left, the incoming wind experienced over Oceano Dunes is modeled using what is known as the California Meteorological Model, or CalMet. This is one of the most commonly used models by the EPA and CARB for meteorological and air pollution transport studies. The model transforms the overall meteorological background conditions, including locally available meteorological information, such as shown in the inside of the left figure, into a specific map of wind speeds experienced on the ground at Oceano Dunes, accounting for variations in topography over a grid of 20 square meter grid cells covering the full domain of the ODS-VRA. So you've got the incoming wind, and then second, in the middle, we have a grid of PM10 mass emissivity, which is determined through a set of detailed surveys using an instrument known as the pi swirl. So the pi swirl works by applying a set of predetermined wind stresses to a small section of ground surface, and then it measures the resulting amount of PM10 mass emissions. And so through an extensive pi swirl survey across the dunes, shown as the grid on the left panel of the middle figure, it is possible to establish an emissivity map across ODS-VRA, as shown on the right panel of the middle figure. So coupled with the incoming wind field from CalMet, it is then possible with the pi swirl grid to determine the full PM10 mass emissions across ODS-VRA, measured as metric tons per day. Note that the original pi swirl emissivity grid was obtained in 2013, and a comprehensive update was performed in 2019. And additional pi swirl observations are now being collected in 2020. So now third, on the right, in the DRI model, the emitted PM10 dust is then subjected to turbulent wind fields that blow the dust downwind from Oceano Dunes. To determine where the dust is dispersed, the DRI model incorporates what is known as the Lagrangian stochastic particle dispersion model, or LSPDM, which is able to track the downwind propagation of the dust plume and can be used to model the expected PM10 dust concentration at CDF and other monitoring sites. Through this approach, it is possible also to show which components of the upwind dust emissions contribute to a specific monitoring site, as shown in the third figure. So the right panel of this figure shows the origin of emissions specifically contributing to PM10 concentrations at CDF. Next slide. So as per the SOA, the evaluation of dust control treatments at Oceano is based on the 10 most emissive days during the windy season of 2013. These 10 days are shown along the bottom of the figure here. And so in orange, the 24-hour mean PM10 concentrations observed at CDF for each of these days is shown, in blue, the mean PM10 concentrations observed as CDF are shown for these top 10 days in units of micrograms per cubic meter. So on average over these top 10 days, the PM10 concentration is 129 micrograms per cubic meter. So now for comparison, the orange diamonds show, instead of dust concentration, the mass emissions of PM10 dust over the riding areas of ODS-VRA as determined not by observations but by the DRI model and measured as metric tons of emitted dust per day. So on average, the mass emissions for these top 10 days was 213.1 metric tons per day. And so you can see that generally variations in the modeled PM10 mass emissions track with variations in the observed PM10 dust concentration. However, this trend is not exact because of variations in specific meteorology conditions day by day, and also model uncertainties. So what this shows is that by using the same set of 10 baseline days for all evaluations of dust control treatment effectiveness, it is therefore possible to perform apples to apples comparisons of specific dust treatments and how they produce reductions in dust mass emissions and concentrations of PM10 dust. Next slide. Okay, so the previous slide showed the baseline conditions for 2013 without any dust control measures. Now we consider the impact of dust control treatments as determined by the DRI model. So the mapped area in yellow on the right, or sorry, on the left, shows the overall ODS-VRA open riding area. The mapped areas in blue are dust control measures implemented between 2013 and 2019, covering 138 acres. The mapped area in purple shows the additional 48-acre foredune, which has been under restoration since late 2019. And finally, the mapped areas in red are the additional 44.4 acres of permanent and seasonal dust control that were mandated by the amended SOA in late 2019. And so the restorations of these areas are now under development for spring 2020. So to see the effect of these treatments, on the right is a figure showing the modeled control effectiveness for the various treatments. These are specified as the percentage reduction in overall dust mass emissions in metric tons per day as the mean over the 10 baseline scenario days relative to the 2013 baseline emissions. So just to give you the baseline, the yellow dot on the bottom left is showing the default case. There's been no treatment, no area under treatment, and therefore no reduction in emissions. So then if you look at the blue diamond, this shows that for roughly 10% area under treatment, the model generates roughly 10% reduction in the total mass emissions of PM10 for these 10 days. As additional areas come under treatment, with the Fordune as the purple diamond and the Spring 2020 projects with the red diamond, you can see that there are additional emissions reductions that are realized. So the key takeaway from this plot is that for the projects through Spring 2020, there's roughly modeled 16.5% reduction in PM10 mass emissions, which corresponds to a roughly equivalent fraction of riding area under dust mitigation treatment. Next slide. So now though, if we consider the impact of these treatments instead in terms of PM10 dust concentrations instead of mass emissions, the model shows a more dramatic change at the CDF monitoring station. So at CDF, the modeled mean PM10 dust concentration pre-mitigation was 123 micrograms per cubic meter, which was similar to the observed value of 128 micrograms per cubic meter. However, once the dust control measures through Spring 2020 are implemented into the DRI model, this has a dramatic impact on the mean dust concentration at CDF. The modeled value of 57 micrograms per cubic meter is over a 50% reduction from 2013. So a big reason why the reduction is so much more dramatic in terms of PM10 concentration instead of in terms of dust emissions is likely because of the fact that many of these control measures are in place directly upwind of the CDF station. Next slide. So in summary, the DRI model shows improvements in air quality from the control projects installed through 2020, both in terms of mass emissions and also in terms of PM10 concentrations at CDF. And so there will be continuing efforts to examine additional needs to meet air quality objectives at sensitive receptor sites going forward. In the following slides, I'm going to talk about some high-level next steps. So next slide. So a major focus of restoration efforts in the next year, which I'm not going to get too into because I think Ian covered it pretty well, is the 48-acre Fordune. So one thing to keep in mind here is that we have 6 different treatment areas, and a big part of the work over the next year is to intensively monitor these different treatment areas via both ground-based and airborne methods to determine their impact on sand transport, on vegetation growth, on geomorphic change, and meteorological effects. And this will help to inform adaptive management for future treatment going forward. And simultaneously, as Ian also mentioned, Parks is moving forward with the 44.4 acres of Spring 2020 controls, including the 40-acre seasonal treatment and the 4.4 acre permanent treatment, which are on the eastern edge of LeGrand Tract, shown as the yellow areas in the figure here. Next slide. So in the next year, the SAG will be also working with Parks to make improvements to all aspects of the DRI model. First, have a better understanding of the modeled wind field. There's a plan to assimilate further wind data from the SODAR station that Ian mentioned that was recently installed at Oceano Dunes, giving high resolution vertical profiles of the wind field to replace the current wind data being assimilated from the faraway Vandenberg Air Force Base. In addition, high resolution modeling efforts are planned to understand the feedback between Fordune development, sediment budgets, and surface wind stresses within and downwind of dust mitigation treatments. So currently the model is not capable of accounting for these feedbacks, which may be causing an underestimation of the reductions in modeled dust emissions. Secondly, a PISRL campaign is currently underway to update the mass of dust emissivity, including the emissivity impacts of recent treatments. This campaign will also shed light on possible changes in emissivity resulting from the recent closure of the ODSVRA to off-highway vehicle activity in late March. So third, we will continue to improve understanding of the attribution of dust sources measured at CDF and other monitoring stations. So currently additional sampling is being conducted to specify the source constituents of PM10 dust. Next slide. So we end the presentation with 2 concluding thoughts. First, since the park has been closed to off-highway vehicle activity since the end of March, there's been a lot of interest in possible impacts of this closure on dust emissions, including SAG's letter that was described by Ian. So I'm not going to reiterate what Ian said, but basically, we believe that this system has been impacted through decades of intensive OHV usage, and it's unlikely the dunes will restore to a natural low emissivity state immediately without OHV activity for a couple of months. But we plan to be doing intensive monitoring to better understand the impact of this change. Second, it's important to stress that there are a large number of dust treatment efforts that have just gotten underway in 2019 and early 2020. And in addition, requisite modeling and monitoring to understand the impacts of these efforts. So it'll take some time to really know the full benefits of the things that have been done recently, and to then inform adaptive management to guide further dust control mitigations. So that's it. Thank you to everyone, and I will now turn things back to the board for comments.
You're muted, John.
Thanks for that. Appreciate it. We'll go to the board for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, just go ahead and hit the hand, and we will raise your hand, and we will take questions in the order they come.
Mr. Paulding and Ms. Compton have their hands up.
I don't see them on here, but okay. Mr. Paulding, why don't you fire away first?
Thank you, Board Chair. And I really appreciate the presentation. Very thorough, quite thorough indeed. I guess my question is more specific to process than the actual presentation itself. So maybe it's better directed to Gary. But in our previous update from the SAG on the status of mitigation, we actually had a staff report that was attached to our report that was, basically gave us an executive summary of everything that you discussed. And I think that executive summary was very helpful because when you get into the weeds, literally, or the plants, I should say, it does get pretty technical. And I think it's important for us to be able to reference kind of a high level summary. And so that's maybe a question for you, Gary, as to why we didn't have that staff report today to work from.
I didn't think that it's kind of premature with the data that we're collecting from all the foredune restoration and things, and that given that we're going to be doing another one of these in October extensively with the hearing board, that would be the better place for such an effort at this time. So just on my part, I didn't think that we had enough data to make conclusions upon to have a report out, a published report.
Okay, I appreciate that response. I guess the trick here is essentially providing enough factual information in a condensed fashion for the public to understand, the high level details about the success of the mitigation to date. For example, I don't even know if in the presentation today we covered kind of the overall success. I think at the last report by the SAG, we had been told that I think there was a 22% reduction that had been tracked in emissions due to mitigation installed to date. And so I just think it's important for the benefit of the public to essentially make sure that they know that there is a lot of money being spent for this mitigation. It's very thorough. But that there are results. And based on the presentation today, from a layperson's perspective, I think it would just seem that there's a lot of work being done, but the whole progress tracking doesn't necessarily, seem to be as successful, maybe, based on the presentation. And so I guess I would just direct that question back to the SAG. If you could just try to, in a short summary fashion, explain the success of mitigation to date. And then specifically, there was a slide that stated, I think we have a modeled projection, I believe, of around 20% reduction in emissions, but explain what we've actually tracked in terms of reductions as opposed to what's modeled.
I don't know, Ian, do you want me to to take a stab at that, or do you feel comfortable with that?
I think what I'll do is defer to Raleigh to reiterate the slide, and then maybe you or Carl could add a bit on observations.
Yeah, so one of the things I was trying to get to, which I'm not sure if it came through, was that, you know, we have this challenge every year, year to year, there's a lot of variability. And so it's hard to see directly from the PM10 measurements at CDF the direct impact in any given treatment, just because of all that background noise. And so the advantage of using these consistent 10 baseline days is that it provides this apples to apples comparison of pre-mitigation versus post-mitigation. And indeed, what it showed was that there's been, I think it was about 16.5% reduction in the mass emissions. That's the overall emitted dust so far, but a more substantial reduction, over 50% in the model PM10 concentration measured at the CDF station.
And how does that correlate to the actual level of improvement in terms of air quality? Are we collecting that information? I know there are a number of monitors there, you know, that the community members of the community have. You know, it's one thing to reduce emissions; it's another thing to track the improvement. If you could shed some light on that, I'd appreciate that.
Jimmy, I might be able to add something to that. It was kind of, I felt premature to do that kind of thing right in the middle of the wind season, because things can play out differently. But when we've looked at this data, we've seen the lowering of the peaks. We wouldn't expect to see that many lowering of the violations, because a lot of those violations are so much higher than the state standard. And so what I asked Carl to provide to me so I can answer some of these questions, even though I feel it's kind of premature, is that give me the number of hours that we've seen above 300 micrograms per meter cubed, which is a high level per an hour, right? It's 5 times this, 6 times the state standard, or double the federal standard. And so for 2020, even though we had CDF had 24 violations compared to last year's 12 of the state standard, the number of hours above 300 micrograms went from 15 in 2019 down to 2 in 2020. And so we saw a doubling of the number of violations, which means we had a windy spring, but yet the number of hours above 300 micrograms went down by a factor 7.5. And so what we've done is, with this mitigation, is we've cut that top down. Now we haven't seen as the MESA 2, which has been the focus of it, hasn't seen that. MESA 2 numbers are up, and now they equal CDF or a little bit more. But what we've noticed is that consistently, you know, our peaks are not that high, even though we've had tremendous winds. So it's anecdotally at this point, we've got data to do it, we've got a partial season, but it appears that that targeted mitigation has really cut down those tall peaks. So when we look at number of violations, yeah, if you're just violating at 65, you know, barely over the standard, which we've had a lot of those, then that's one thing. But the fact that we're not seeing these huge peak hours is a huge accomplishment. Now, you know, it's still early, but you know, the fact that we've only had 2 hours at CDF above 300 micrograms per meter cube is tremendous. So that's not the goal, but that shows we're getting there at the right way. And so, you know, when we do the dunes, when we do the foredune development, some of that stuff causes it to move even faster initially. Some of it does in different areas. So, you know, it takes time to stabilize, and the plants aren't grown up yet. We're assuming in the modeling that they're going to be doing one thing. Well, they're not grown yet. So the input to the modeling will have to change. So it's complex. I think we're seeing great results, especially getting those peaks down. In October for the hearing board, after we've gone through pretty much the entire season, we're going to make a presentation upon that so we can look at it and gather some more data and have time to analyze it when the wind's not blowing.
Excellent. And I'll look forward to that report. And it is good to hear that we are, you know, looking at that high level goal of reducing emissions by 50%, you know, that we're tracking in that direction. And it sounds like the team is confident that the work being done is certainly leading toward that goal. I guess my last question would be, a member of the public had asked me, how is this all funded, the costs associated with the mitigation? And it was my understanding that much of the funding did directly come from the OHV division of state parks. Is that correct?
They're doing all the funding that I'm aware of.
Okay. Okay.
The district is not funding. Well, we're funding our labor and our time right now, and state parks pays for 2 of the monitors that we have down in that area, but we're operating another 4 without charging anybody. So we are spending considerable district resources on monitoring our own monitoring, but we're not paying for any of the state parks monitoring stuff.
And with the OHV funding, that's partially, I'm sure, taxpayer funded by the state, but it also somehow relates to the licensing and fees and things collected directly for off-road vehicles. Is that correct?
Yeah, from my knowledge of it is that most of it comes from a percentage of the gasoline tax that's in a formula that they have. They do gate receipts provides some of the money, but not nearly as much as the fuel tax portion of the fuel tax that they get. So I would expect state parks to see a drop in their fuel tax revenue. I do by everybody up by whatever the state of California sees from the COVID crisis, a drop in that. But the majority of the funding, to my knowledge, comes from the vehicle fuel money.
Thank you. Those are all my comments. Again, I appreciate all the hard work being done by the SAG and staff. Thank you.
Great. Supervisor Compton.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I off mute?
We can hear you.
Okay, so I actually agree with the previous comment that it would have been nice to see at least the slides or an overview. I mean, this is the biggest portion of our meeting today, and to be able to look it over and formulate questions and see it before we're just seeing it during a meeting. So it would have been nice to have that, even if it was premature, just to see the overhead. So perhaps next time. So I have a couple of questions. So I know you talked about a little bit the percentages or the direct impact, but on the 48-acre Dune down by the shoreline project, what exactly does the modeling show with regard to the potential to reduce dust on the mesa compared to what we expected it to show? Because I thought I've heard the number 20% touted or around that before, but what exactly does it show as a percentage? So that's my first question, as a percentage for the mesa.
Raleigh, did you want to go to the earlier slide where you showed the incremental outcomes? Maybe just speak to that. Yeah, that slide there.
Right. So the difference between before the 4 dunes are added and after is basically the difference between the blue diamond and the purple diamond. So it's a significant reduction.
So what, 5%? Is it 5? Is it? I mean, I'm looking at it.
I don't know exactly. I might refer this question to Jack Gillies, who's also on the SAG, who's on the line. He might be able to speak more specifically to the.
Well, if I'm looking at it looks like it's, I mean, I'd love to hear from him too, but if I'm looking at this chart, if you're saying, if I'm looking at it correctly, the purple dot versus the blue dot, well, no, it'd be less than 5%. It'd be 2.5%, correct?
It appears it's about, in the order of 2 to 3%.
Didn't we expect it to be 20%?
I don't remember the specific expectation that was set previously. Maybe
So
Gary.
it's about 2 to 3%. Okay, well, that I thought there was a 20% number touted before. My next question is the other sources that we've talked about in previous meetings, whether it be agriculture or coming in from the valley or things like that, was that taken into consideration in the stipulated order of abatement? Were those figures from those other alternate sources taken into consideration?
That must be a question for me. In the stipulated order of abatement, they are kind of built in there, but not not specifically, because it's modeled off of the dunes itself with the wind direction, and that portion of it is the percentage of reduction from that area. And that percentage of reduction, the 50% mass thing, was just to get us started with. I mean, the whole idea, you know, it's the guesstimate target number. How do you get started? Well, we got started with a 50% mass base. As soon as we see what happens with these 4 dunes and happens downwind of the other mitigation areas, we can adjust things, and quite possibly, and I believe it will change, and we won't need a 50% reduction after we see the stabilization of that sand movement coming off the 4 dune. And what happens when you stabilize that? What happens downwind of that on the dunes on the backside? Right now, we're just assuming that the dunes downwind of the 4 dunes don't change, but we know they will. We just don't have we don't have really a right to guess. If you put down, well, we'll guess how much it's going to change, people are going to come after you by using the guess amount. But like I reiterated earlier about the number of hours above 300 micrograms being so much lower at CDF, it's working. It's working for CDF. We're unsure about what's going on at Mesa too. We'll have to get a complete analysis of this year's wind events prior to the October 23rd hearing board update meeting, which we will produce a report for and have that available during that meeting.
Okay, so I guess your answer to me in the first part of your answer was it's not really taken into consideration because we're just looking at the modeling. So my next question that just brought to mind by something you just said, Gary, is on that 50% stipulated or abatement, where did that number, how was that number determined? Was that, I know you said it can be adjusted later, but was that just an arbitrary number, or how did we arrive on that 50% number?
Carl did some work for us to try to get an idea about just a gross number about what it would take to get to the equivalent number of violations that would have occurred if the writing wasn't there, assuming that, you know, that area had the same emission rate as areas that weren't being ridden upon. And the 50% number came from that. It is always meant to be a starting point. And I always assumed that after we got things going, that we would go back to the hearing board, show them what we've done and the reductions that we've seen at CDF, and then get out of that simple mass-based approach. But we had a hard time getting the hearing board to accept anything other than having some hard mass-based levels. And we were directed by the hearing board to do so. And so, you know, we came up with this this number, and you know, it may not be necessary, and I don't think 50% is going to be necessary. You know, we'll know in a year.
Okay, so that does answer my question, but then it begs another question. So even though you say you don't want to guess and that we may not need the 50%, do you believe that that 50% goal is attainable? If that was your goal, do you believe that that is attainable? I mean, I'm not asking you to guess. I'm just saying based on the projected models.
Based on the projected models with the inputs to the models right now, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's quite attainable with projected inputs of the model, but the modeling inputs are going to change. And that's what's not inherent in the current modeling projections in the future, is that the emissivity and the wind speeds associated with that emissivity of those different back dunes are going to change. And so that's not built into the model. And until we see the changes that the 4 dunes make to that, we won't really know what emissivity to put into those back dunes. We'll have to get it established and test it and then put them in the model.
Okay, and then my last question, and I've heard a range from, I guess just today somebody said 3 to 6 months to hundreds of years. So I want kind of the expert opinion on how many months or years or a range is it that an area needs to have no riding before you can determine, you know, getting back to its natural state? Because there are people that have said on record, it would be hundreds of years or however many years writing was done in that area. That's how many years we have to go without writing to determine it. But then today I heard a couple months right now is not enough time, but maybe a couple more months is. So can one of the experts give me some kind of a range, minimum and maximum? Is it hundreds of years? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? What is it?
I'll take this one. I mean, it's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, the number of processes ongoing here, from plants to nutrient transfers to daily storms and dust events to the longer term sediment supply and dune evolution here is complicated. I know scientists always say this, but it's true. If we focus on the foredune itself, it takes foredunes of this size years to decades to develop. And I won't be more specific than that, because the reality is we don't know. We're kickstarting the system, so it could be 4 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 15, we don't know. But what I can tell you is it will be faster than nature's devices alone with no riding. And it's better than full closure.
Decades, could be decades.
Well, if we're talking about dust emissions, it could be, so I want to draw your attention to the map that's on the screen here. You know, in the past year, we've implemented dozens of acres of new control. So, you know, we seem to be focusing on the foredune quite a bit. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's an upwind process, but we have these huge blue polygons in behind that have also been stabilized. And, you know, we're starting, I think we will start to see, you know, Gary alluded to, you know, dropping the peak on the emissions curves, which is encouraging. I agree with him. I think it's a bit premature to say that this is fully related to treatments. But once these treatments kick in, we are fundamentally altering the physics of the system. We're seeing very early and very subtle indications of that, but it takes foredunes of this size. You know, I've seen foredunes of this size evolve in very different vegetation settings in 4 or 5 years to their previous disturbance state after wiped out by hurricanes. This is a very different system. We don't have hurricanes, we have different vegetation, we have a different climate. So based on what I've seen in air photos and our assessment of the Oso Flaco site, you know, we're probably talking about a decade to be conservative for the full development to Oso Flaco sized dunes. It could take longer than that. But that's not to say that we won't see a dust reduction prior to that. Again, we're kickstarting the system here. We're not just closing it off and leaving nature alone. So I hope that answers a portion of your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those were my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we're going to go to Mayor Waggy next for questions.
And thank you very much. It's a very impressive study thus far. Again, it looks like we've gotten far beyond what the phase 2 study looked at and getting some real good data now. Just a couple somewhat technical questions on your Lagrangian stochastic model. Is that an a priori model, or does it require parameters to adjust to fit the results?
Raleigh, did you want to take that?
I guess I can briefly comment, and then I can hand it over to Jack if he wants to talk further about it, since he's kind of the master of the model. So the Lagrangian model is, as far as I know, independently deployed without any kind of tuning specific to, you know, try to match the results to the observations.
So is that the answer?
Can you hear me, Mr. Waggy?
We can hear you.
Yes, I can. I was wondering if Jack was going to chime in.
Yeah. So in the original model development that's occurred over the last few years, it was originally based on data that we collected on the wind fields in 2013 and the emissivity that was measured back then. And the development of that model is been published in the peer-reviewed literature and available for review. But I think in the beginning we were looking at the what the model predicted from the emissivity based on the pi-swirl measurements, and reconciling that with the measurements that were made at the CDF and Mesa 2 site. So there's no large scale tuning of model knobs to make the numbers come into reconciliation.
And then I guess the second question, I think I saw a graph some time ago that seems to fit fairly well. What's your impression as far as how accurate it is?
Well, I think the model is doing exceptionally well. And in terms of my colleague at the California Air Resources Board, Earl Withicum, was queried about model performance and what is expected. And from an EPA perspective, he related to us at the meeting that when they look at air quality modeling versus measurements, they are considered valid if they're within a factor of 2. And we are our performance is well beyond that. We're at some of our days are, I think the biggest difference between a measurement and a modeling is like 50%, but most of our modeled numbers are within, I don't know, much less than a 50% difference. So the model is running in higher resolution than any other air quality model that's kind of trying to do this kind of air quality modeling. And there's no other widespread dust emission source that's as actively characterized with emissivity measurements as the Oceano dunes. So we have the highest quality input data available anywhere, and we're trying to also now improve that with the model assimilates measurements that are made on the ground with meteorology, and by adding the upper air data from the SODAR, we are actively trying to improve the model performance even more.
Well, I guess the point is, and the model will really help in trying to characterize what's going on as far as mitigation and so forth. Again, that sounds very impressive, and I want to thank you for all your work. That's all I have.
All right, thank you, Mayor Wagi. Supervisor Arnold.
Yes, I had a few questions. And Dr. Walker, Dr. Martin, thank you for this presentation. It was really interesting. I try to keep up with your language that sometimes I'm not completely with you. So anyway, I appreciate everything you're doing. So what I just heard, I think in the discussion on the questions that we've already heard, is that the SOA had a goal of reducing emissions by 50%. And we heard that that's probably an unattainable goal. So my first question is what happens if we can't attain a goal that's been put in place? It seems kind of arbitrarily, but still, is that goal really locked down, or anybody know the answer to that one?
Yeah, I can answer that. And so the goal itself is fixed right now, but it can be changed with a hearing board process. And when we started the initial hearing board action a number of years ago, I told them I was going to be bringing it back for changes. And we're lucky we haven't had to do so yet, but we will be going back to the hearing board for changes as soon as we find out, the measures that we've done, how they're playing out. We get some more data. We're looking at the peaks that we have taken down. The fact that we've only had 2 hours above 300 micrograms at CDF is phenomenal. Initially, when the hearing board got involved, we couldn't get them to buy just a reduction. We'll work on a reduction somehow. They wanted a concrete number. And so we had to develop the 50% thing for the hearing board.
Well, I guess what I'm worried about is if we set an unattainable goal, we're doing all this work, we know we can't attain that goal, or it was a too lofty, it wasn't a practical goal. Does this process then allow for closures or things based on not attaining an unattainable goal? I'm just wondering where the process might lead us when we can't attain the goal. You're saying we can go back and ask to change the goal, but is it possible that the hearing board or whoever else weighs in says, nope, that was the goal, you failed, we're going to go a different direction? Or what's happening with this process?
I guess that would be possible, but by us showing the reductions that we're getting and we're going towards the ultimate goal of reducing the emissions from the riding area to as if it was just natural open sand, that we're getting there, and this goal needs to be adjusted because we didn't need those numbers, then that's what we do. The hard part is, we're modeling things, and it's, 50%, being off by 50% is good. And so, but really the goal is to clean up the air, and that's the ultimate goal of the order. And that we're making progress towards. So that initial goal was just to have a number to say, hey, you got to go out there and do some serious reductions. They can't just be, wave your hands and say it's going to work. And that's what that goal is. And that's why it said the initial goal. So to me, the whole thing is set to bring that back after we've knocked this thing down. We understand what we're doing. We put some sustainable systems in place. Now what should that goal be? And we take that back to the hearing board after we've got some data from our foredunes and the mid-dune data, in about a year. I would expect, maybe next summer to go back with the hearing board and ask them. And we'll talk to the hearing board about that again during our informational meeting in October. But that's ultimately, we're looking to get the numbers down to, I think when we looked at the estimate about if the writing wasn't there, there'd be like 14 or 15 violation days a year at CDF. And so that's the number we're looking for, to shave those huge peaks, to get rid of those 400 microgram per meter cubed hours, and then put it down so we're only, getting a dozen or so lower level violations of the state air standard a year.
Okay, so then when you talk about reducing the emissions by 50%, or the goal of the SOA is to reduce the dust by 50%. Right now we're looking at a screen that says there's a 16.5 reduction in the riding area on emissions. But another slide that we looked at that I think Dr. Martin had, that one, talks about 53.7% reduction in CDF, the PM10 concentration. So for someone like me, when you switch these out, in other words, show me the goal. And how does this slide right here mix with the other slide with the 60% emissions reduction? And what exactly, because this is what we're monitoring, correct? The PM10 concentration?
Correct. This slide has to do with how it affects that one point at the CDF station. So right now, a lot of these focused reductions are in a narrower band towards the CDF station and not along the whole length of the riding area. And so when you look at the amount of reductions that we've done in front of the CDF site, it's a much larger number than just that 15%. Say most of that 15% has been done in front of the CDF site. And so there's a whole lot of other area that hasn't been reduced as much as that.
Okay. So yes, so our 50% goal, going back to that is intended to cover the entire area. So we're going to have to average all this and still meet the 50% or whatever else you change it to.
Yeah.
To meet a goal. Okay. So then again, for me, I heard several times in both Dr. Walker, Dr. Martin's presentation that talking about the natural conditions. And I think for me, all these years, that's been at the crux of everything is, does the OHV recreational activity really change so far off of the natural conditions of the system? So one of the slides talked about introducing roughness and what that meant and so forth. But I'm just wondering how that relates to the natural condition, and if we're trying to imitate the natural condition, I heard in the slides that we're trying to return to low natural emissivity state, but how do we know that that was a natural condition and that the natural condition didn't sometimes create a high emissivity? That being said, I also heard through the presentation that we use 2013, the windy season of 2013, as the pre-control baseline to measure that, but I never really heard what that was and how far we were off this spring from that baseline. In other words, where's our gap? And if that's our baseline, were we off our baseline? And then kind of going back to that concept of natural state, and trying to figure that out. It's just interesting to me that this year we had an unexpected windy spring season to measure this. It was unexpected that we would have no OHV activity. So when we look at that and we see basically that we got the same results as we did with the OHV writing going on, again, if we're looking for the natural baseline here, that's got to be telling us something. The projects, I get that we're planting and we're doing things. I don't even know if that's part of the natural state. We're doing man-made projects to try to reduce emissions, but again, in the end of this, do the OHV areas contribute? How much? Nothing at all. Oh, they make a big difference and take us away from that natural state. I don't know. That's what I'm really interested in finding out with all of this kind of put together and all this modeling. So I'm just wondering anyway, you answered my question, I guess, that you looks like we'll be probably changing the goals here once we start to get information from this modeling, correct?
Yes, and with the overall goal has not changed. The overall goal is to bring the emission levels down just to open sand levels that if the open sand wasn't written upon, the emissivity levels, and the number of exceedances, so, and the level of the exceedances. So those goals are still there. The 50% goal basically put in there to make sure we got started on significant things and move toward that direction quickly.
I guess, Gary, what I'm just saying and what I still am feeling is that nothing in all of this have really shown. If our goal is to reduce emissivity on the dunes, okay, but if it's in its natural state, a high emissivity area, OHVs or no OHVs, that I just think that we need to reflect that. We need to say, hey, we might, as humans, we might improve this area because we don't like emissivity, but I just don't want to forget. For example, something else that was mentioned is dust coming in over the ocean. I don't know if that's being considered. That's part of the natural state. Are we, I guess in the long run, are we trying to change the natural state to be more human friendly, or are we trying to figure out if we're doing something to that absolutely increases emissivity in that area? And I don't see anything in here that says that we are yet, that the OHV area changes it yet. It looks like we're improving it by by constructing projects, but back to that natural state. Anyway, that's all my questions and comments.
I think that you make some good points, and the emissivity study done by the Pice World stuff that DRI has done shows that just to one side of riding area to the other, the emissivity changes across the fence line dramatically with no other inputs. The amount of dust coming off of an area that's actively ridden upon, the other side of the fence where it's bare sand and it's not ridden upon, is 5 to 8 times more emissive just on the other side of the fence where it's not ridden upon. So I think that data is out there. There's definitely a big difference between areas that are ridden upon and not. So you know, everything else is a pretty complex system. And, you know, trying to hold all these balls in my head sometimes is mind numbing. It's just, but I go back to the PICE world data that DRI has done, showing emissivity changes on one side versus riding on the other, right next to each other, bare sand to bare sand. So that's the data that we have, and that's why we're here.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I appreciate you bringing that data up, Gary, because Supervisor Arnold's attempts to confuse this situation with what constitutes a natural background continue to waste our time, frankly. But I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. You indicated a little bit ago that your goal is to clean up, our goal is to clean up the air, and you think we're making progress. And yet we see in just recent weeks more violations than we saw before. And by your estimate, most of those exceedances, more exceedances than we saw before, but most of those exceedances you're suspecting would also be violations of Rule 1001, which indicate that the greater emissivity of the riding area is still a problem. So my first point is, and I don't want to belabor the technical issues of your interpretation of those peak numbers, because there are a lot of variables that need to be controlled for there. But I just make it as a comment. I'm not seeing that we're actually cleaning up the air just yet. The second thing I want to get clear is what is your approach and what is your initiative regarding holding state parks to compliance with the stipulated order of abatement. The stipulated order abatement says that the mass emissions shall be reduced by 50% over 5 years. And right now, you know, the data that was shown here, assuming that the treatments underway have the desired effect on emissivity, are only going to achieve something like a 15% reduction in the mass emissions there. And so my question is state parks continuing efforts to develop mitigations that are aimed at meeting the 50% reduction within the 5-year period? Are they still working in that direction?
Yes, they're still working in that direction.
Okay.
So we're running into changes in the modeling based upon different scenarios that are making it hard to come up with the total 50%. We don't believe at this point we're gonna see a lot more reductions than the models predicting, because models are not. I mean, this is not you know, a micrometer. It's something
Models,
going towards something.
Mr. Willie, models are a calculation based on, you know, the physical inputs, and they're our best estimate of what's going on. And I can accept that methodology because we can't measure with a scale any gram of material that's coming off. But I'm curious, upon what basis do you conclude that a 50% reduction in mass emissions is unattainable? Because, you know, these efforts, these mitigations right now have affected a relatively small area of the ODSVRA, and state parks itself had estimated that perhaps as much as 500 acres were going to have to be treated in order to get to that goal. And I'd like to hear whether you're pushing for them to get to that goal.
I am pushing them to get to that goal. The model, however, without having updated inputs to it, is not a reliable model for the end game. It's good for picking your actions as you move along, but without the new inputs of emissivity that's been created, changes that's been created by your mitigations, it's really it's not as good. It's statically, when you look at it, it's good, but then the changes, if the changes that you are trying to predict aren't put into the model, you don't know exactly what those changes are going to be. The modeling, I think that the DRI had come up and said that they looked at the entire La Grande track would have to be controlled with the assumed modeled inputs. at this point. But now Jack can come on and.
Well, but if that's the order that they're working under, is State Parks working toward that end?
We are working towards that end.
Okay, that's what I want my assurance. I get it that the model may need to be adjusted based on observations. That's perfectly reasonable science. But I am concerned about the idea that we're doing mitigations that may take years to achieve their desired effect, and that we're just going to sit back and wait for that to happen, as opposed to continuing efforts that are stipulated in that order of abatement.
I think it should be noted that there are large effects that happen shorter term. And many times the dune geomorphologists, they want to look at, what is the stabilized steady state dune field going to look like? And that's that long-term effect. Now the emissivity changes keep occurring over time as it matures, but then, this is just my understanding of it. They have different things happen, different wind scenarios, different storm scenarios, and you get some blowouts here and there. And until you get to this, more mature area, it doesn't stabilize. So that's that longer term. It doesn't mean you're not seeing big solid reductions, because we will. It just won't be a stabilized dune field that kind of looks the same thing year after year.
All right, and I'll just leave it at the fact that we haven't seen big solid reductions in the concentration of particulate matter in the air downwind, which is the key here, and the key to protecting public health. So with that, I'll thank you, and we can go ahead and get on with the meeting.
Okay, Ms. Fonzie.
Thank you. I think we've learned something this morning. It's very complex. It's very scientific with controls and others. And what I would like to see communicated to the public is where we are. I think it's very important that we simplify this, and there's an art form to this. It's not easy to do, but we need to tell the public, whether it's in a press release or on a website or a handout at a future meeting, whatever it may be. I would leave that up to staff, but I'd like to state the goals that we have on ours, that we want a 50% reduction, what's been spent so far by state parks, so that people know that there's money being put on the table, what was done this year. We don't need to go back forever, but we need to go back and say that we're doing these plantings and make it simple, and talk about the percent of decrease that we are expecting to have from what we've done this year. And something about how this is the most instrumented dune field on the planet, I think is actually of interest to the public. But we need to get something out that's simple. And I would ask staff to work on a press release, if this is the will of the rest of the board, or some other means that we can let them know where we are now, so the public can be involved in the process. This scientific report is interesting, but it's beyond what we really need. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Seeing no other hand, oh, there's Mayor Heading.
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you, Drs. Walker, Martin, and Gary, for the information and the comprehensive presentation. I appreciate a lot of the comments that were made. I think as a non-scientist public member, it would be very difficult to interpret the information that's been presented. However, those of us that are in the middle of this and have been for a while, I think it makes a modicum of sense. I have a couple of observations, and I'd like Dr. Walker and Martin to correct me if I'm incorrect. If I wrote down my notes correctly, the baseline study case for the 10 most emissive days in 2013 for the mean PM10 microgram per cubic meter concentration for the 10 most emissive days in the non-riding area was 129. And was I correct in writing down that in the riding area, it was 213?
Raleigh, did you want to take that? And maybe the slide related?
First of all, I heard you say non-riding area. The number I had was 120. I forget if it's 129 or 128.
129 in the, or 128 in the non-riding area, and then I believe you spoke to the riding area being 213. Just wanted to verify that.
Could you go back a slide? Okay, so let me clarify here. Apologies. So these are actually both referring to dust emissions primarily from the riding area. The difference is that the orange diamonds are showing the mass of emissions. It's the total amount of dust that's being picked up as like an actual physical mass or weight of dust from the riding area, and that's 213 metric tons per day. The blue circle is the concentration that is measured downwind at the CDF site, which would include contributions both from the riding area and from non-riding areas. Does that clarify?
Yeah, that does. I probably wrote that down incorrectly, but that does clarify it for me. And so that becomes your base case assumption of parameters for measurement based upon data from 2013 that you just cited.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And the reduction that we have through spring of 2020 is 16.5% reduction in mass emissions in the riding area.
Yes, so that would be in terms of the orange diamonds. The mass emissions would be the 15.6% reduction.
Okay.
Whereas with the PM10, the purple, or so the blue circle, that's where we have the 50-some% reduction in concentration.
So my direct question, and perhaps it was asked indirectly previously, if we have through the stipulated agreement a goal for targeting 50% reduction in PM10 mass emissions over a 5-year period, can you say at this time that that is a realistic goal or potentially an attainable goal?
I think that Gary has already addressed that question. I certainly think it's possible to achieve significantly more reduction in mass emissions, but it will all depend on how quickly these restoration projects evolve and also the total area of restoration that is brought under control.
And is there any way to determine how soon in your modeling you might be able to make a determination as to the validity of the target goal? Are we talking about another year, 2 years?
Obviously, some of this is subject to the uncertainty of what projects are conducted. I think, in my view, one of the big things that we would like to improve in the model, in addition to just having more updated measurements of emissivity on the treated surfaces, is to also look at the impacts of, say, the foraging restoration on what happens downwind. So that's not at all accounted for right now, but we expect that as those roughness elements develop, as the foredunes develop, as sand supply is limited to the downwind locations, that's going to have a feedback not only on emissions from the foredunes themselves, but also on emissions from the downwind areas. And so I think that's one of the focal areas of the improvements that we want to make to the model in the coming years.
Good. I guess the point is, if we're dealing with an unrealistic, unattainable goal, we're going to spend a lot of time, effort, and money not being able to achieve something that's unrealistic. And I was just trying to get at potentially when that determination might be made, because what I heard Gary say is that this goal that has been set or stipulated through the agreement at the hearing board may well be a moving target. And I'll ask either Gary or members of the SAG to comment on that.
Well, I can start out with comment. I always assumed that we would be back with this hearing board item, even though we came back earlier last year for a different reason. We were, after we established our initial mitigations and got some foredunes in place, and see how they behaved and changed the system. And so, yes, I never thought we would stay with the exact same metrics. I thought that as soon as we showed significant improvements, that we could go back to the hearing board and ask them to modify it with a concrete plan to show how we're going to get to the end result, which is concentrations downwind and not some mass number that may or may not be necessary. So yeah, it's just the nature of this beast. It's an adaptive management process. We had to start with some number. It was a good number to start with. It may be necessary to get that far. I don't think so, but that's what we're planning to do. And until we can come up with the reductions to show the hearing board that we're on the path to getting the concentration numbers to the appropriate levels, not the mass, but the concentrations, we can't really go back to them and say, hey, can you modify that metric? And so that's my point. If we, after these dunes start getting established, we get some more emissivity data behind the dunes, how they've affected things, then we'll be in a better position to go to the hearing board and say, hey, we would like to modify these. We're still, the ultimate goal is the concentrations that would occur if that was just bare sand not ridden upon. That's our goal. State standard or bare sand not ridden upon.
Great, thank you. And getting back to Supervisor Compton's question, maybe I can ask it in a different way. With regard to the PM10 data that you're collecting, are you only doing quantitative data, or are you looking at any qualitative measures in your studies?
I guess I'll take that. As far as I'm aware, we're working with on-site measurements, whether they be the air quality measurements or the sand flux measurements. So these are all quantifiable things. I'm not aware of any qualitative data. Are you thinking of things like visibility, or are there other things you're thinking about? I don't know how to.
Well, there have been several comments as to, you know, is there a phytoplankton that's being blown in and contributing to PM10 concentration? Are there other sources other than sand that might make up the PM10 concentration? So my question is really, you're measuring PM10 concentration in micrograms per cubic meter, but are you looking at specifically what the contents contain or are made up of?
Thanks for clarifying. There are studies underway to try and assess what the actual constituents of the dust are. And I think Gary alluded to this earlier. There's both a study underway by Scripps looking at potential marine contributions, and there's also new efforts by the Desert Research Institute to look at just that.
But not by the SAG?
Both Scripps and DRI are working kind of independently, but their results do feed back into the SAG for our review.
So you will be, your group
was on the
will be reviewing
recommendation of, listen, just to clarify that the new measurements to look at the chemical composition of the dust is based on the recommendation from the SAG. The SAG doesn't actually carry out the research. It suggests what to do or recommends studies to be done, and then that was handed off to someone capable of doing the measurements and the analysis.
Great, I appreciate that clarification. Do you have any idea perhaps when those study data might be available?
I think that I'll have to check with Carl, but we're collecting that data right now at our CDF site and sending the samples in. So we're actually, you know, assisting with that part of it. So Carl, are you on the line?
Yes, Gary, I'm here. Yes, we're collecting 20 to 25 samples at CDF this year for what we call speciation, meaning that they will be sent to the lab at DRI, where they'll be analyzed, and we'll find out the elemental composition, you know, how much different metals, different, you know, the different chemical constituents are in each sample. And then from that data, we hope to be able to see what the source, have like fingerprints for what the source or sources might be. Now, the assumption or sort of the working hypothesis is that we're mostly seeing sand from the beach. So we expect to see lots of silicon and aluminum and similar species. But, you know, we're undertaking this study because we might be surprised. We're undertaking it because the SOA says we have to, but we might be surprised by what we see. So we're taking these samples. As I said, we're going to do 20 to 25 samples, and we're basically just collecting them now. I think we've already collected 7 or 8, and once we've collected all the samples, we'll ship everything to DRI, and they'll do the analysis in one big batch. So we probably won't have even raw data back until the late fall, but we will, we'll share the raw data with the SAG. Any analysis that we do, or we will do an analysis, and we'll share that analysis with the SAG and with the public, and it'll probably come to the board in some sort of report as well.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all the questions I have.
Okay, we're going to go to public comment now. We have two of the most patient individuals in the history of the APCD from public comment. So Jared, can you hear me? You got 3 minutes.
Yes. Hello, my name is Jared McLeod. I'm with California Off-Road Vehicle Association and Off-Roaders United. At the December 2019 APCD hearing in San Luis Obispo, the APCD ordered the closure of 48 acres of prime beach camping, which began late 2019. This closure reduced the available camping area of ODS VRA by more than 50%. When the California Coastal Commission pushed forward this emergency closure ahead of schedule, parks failed to meet the requirements of the SOA and CEQA to properly model and survey these closures. The January OHMVR Commission meeting in Arrowhead, this was confirmed. Almost immediately following, parks began spreading hay bales all over the 48 acres. Due to these closures not being properly modeled, the high tides have been reaching well within the fence lines, pulling the hay into the ocean, and the remaining hay blowing up to the surrounding communities. More recently, there has been miles of non-biodegradable orange fencing installed at the dunes, which has already become buried by the sand and reclaimed by the dunes. The APCD claims this is all necessary to meet a dust particulate reduction as dictated by SAG. What is quite ironic, though, is that since the beach camping and OHV riding at Oceano Dunes was closed for the COVID restrictions on March 28th, the air monitoring exceedances have doubled in May 2020 compared to May 2019. Now the APCD and SAG are backpedaling this recent data and claiming it is due to long-term effects of OHV activity. It's really funny because SAG fails to explain how the dunes have been fundamentally altered from OHV. We have all heard the experimental 48 acres area has reduced virtually no dust emissions as evidenced in the recent data collected at the CDF. What percentage of the modeling the 48 acres for dunes precinct, and where is it documented? How do the results match the modeling predictions? What we see as a major fault by the APCD to be continuing to rely solely on the botched and perpetuated inaccurate scientific data and modeling by the Scientific Advisory Group. All this is clearly based on the APCD's fraudulent claims and discriminating anti-OHV narrative. Recently, the Scripps Institute has conducted its own independent research study and submitted their reports. The Scripps report has shed a breath of fresh air and much needed new light on the subject of natural saltation, dust particulates, and air quality from in and around ODS VRA. Corvo would like to see the APCD start listing the research and data collection of Scripps Institute and other third-party groups and stop relying solely on the findings of the Scientific Advisory Group. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jared, for your patience. We're going to move on to Nick Harris now. Nick, can you hear us? Nick, are you there?
There we go. They just unmuted me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for, it's been a long but good informative presentation. First of all, I guess I'm encouraged to hear some statements saying that the proposed reduction of 50% may not be obtainable. And so I think it would be reassuring to the community that statement is made rather clearly, or there's some sort of acknowledgement or a resolution passed acknowledging that as data is collected, as the effects of various things being implemented are found or measured, that this may or may not be an obtainable thing. I think that would be very important, and I'm concerned of the idea of going back a year or 2 years or 5 years from now and saying, hey, what do you know, that wasn't really obtainable. I'm afraid that you've committed to it at that point. So that worries me. And to kind of a more broader statement or a more broader topic, my understanding is the computer modeling showed that areas that were proposed for mitigation were basically removed from the dust footprint or from emitting dust. So I know this was done in the initial computer modeling of the 48 acres, and I'm curious if this has been shown to really have little or no effect, despite being called a hotspot at the commission meeting in November, I believe it was. It just seems like we were told this is going to be huge. We're going to see this massive reduction, and then they said staff actually at the time was asked, and they were told they said they weren't necessarily in agreement with that, and now it turns out we have not seen a massive reduction. So again, we seem to be implementing things, not finding the desired or expected effect, and then justifying them frankly in a new way that I've never heard before. So that concerns me, and I'm also concerned about the fact that we're now being told, I've heard today, 1 week, 1 month, 5 years, 100 years. I mean, that is no way to make a land management decision. I'm very concerned that this, again, seems to be pretty new. And so if we're this highly monitored, monitored dune structure, I think that we need to figure out a much more, verifiable and frankly, short-term method or I don't even know how you could say something that, 10 years from now, what's the interim solution going to be? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nick. We're going to go now to JD Shaw. JD, you're going to have 3 minutes. Go ahead. We're going to remove them. There we go. JD, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of comments and then a question. I'm not sure that I could be able to get the question answered, but the first comment is the goal is to clean up the air, but isn't the air in this area of California considered green? There's several government sites that keep showing the Pomo Mesa is green, red areas are Bay Area, LA, Bakersfield. So it seemed like there was we're already in a very clean area of California. There's also mention about what is the estimate of particulate matter if no writing was ever occurred. And I've never seen any data so far that shows what would be the estimate in a natural sand dune. And there's plenty of area of the sand dune where there's no vegetation, and what is that particulate concentration and what is that theoretical number would be. So now my question, which it might not be able to be answered live, is on the 50% reduction. There's a number, and I haven't seen exactly what that 50% reduction is on. There's been talk about peak hours. So are you trying to get 50% of peak hours? If there's 20 peak hours that are violated, are we trying to get that down to 10? Or are we trying to reduce particulate matter? Because in the PMRP report that I saw, it showed a 93-day average of 51 micrograms per cubic meter, which is already at the state level. So are we trying to do 50% of that or 50% of ours? So what is the actual 50% of what actual data?
Thanks for that. We'll get back to you on the answer to that question.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to next is I think it's Leah Rigo Hensley.
Mr. Chair, one quick comment before we move on to Ms. Hensley is I do see that we have 2 phone call-in listeners, and I just wanted to make sure that they are aware they can raise their hand to speak by pressing *9. So if those 2 callers wanted to speak, they could press *9 to participate.
Lee Rigo Hensley.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Go right ahead. You have 3 minutes.
All right. Good morning, you guys. My name is Leah Rigo Hensley. I'm with Off-Roaders United. My husband, Danny Hensley, and I also own Freedom Ropes, a local small business based out of Oceano. We are Oceano residents. The scientific facts tell us air quality in this area has almost nothing to do with off-roading and everything to do with the wind. In fact, we have received over 20 air quality warnings in this area since March 27th, the last day off-roaders touched the sand. So now the science is proving we have a wind problem, not an OHV problem. We should probably all start working together for a better solution. That solution is WeatherSolve Wind Fence. WeatherSolve Wind Fence has been proven to reduce wind speeds by 80% and help create better air quality by reducing the wind, which then will reduce the sand and dust in our air. WeatherSolve Wind Fence is ready to come to Oceano and scope out the best location to build the fence. We need to take down those ugly, dangerous, 4-foot, worthless plastic orange fences. Taking down these fences will help create a more beautiful and much safer park for all of us, including the wildlife. Science is what I keep hearing at these meetings, but I think you should probably start being honest and say biased science. When is the right time for all of us to have the right to have scientists speaking for us? Weathersolve Wind Fence is ran by engineers and scientists, and again, they will be here as soon as this closure is lifted. To end this speech, I would like to state that it doesn't take a scientist to know and understand that thousands of years of wind blowing would cause much more dust, sediment, and sand in the air than any of the off-roaders have caused. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. We're now going to move on to the next person who has a 805-343 number, and you'll have 3 minutes as soon as we unmute your microphone. And if you could state your name for the record, because we don't have it on the screen.
First and last name, please. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello, this is Rochelle Toady. What is it?
You're getting a really bad echo.
Yeah, I see that. I'm in front of my computer on my phone.
Okay, that's
well,
probably walk into another room on your phone. We'll hold
I'll try that. Okay, I just wanted to make a few points. One is that it's my understanding that the red boxes that were shown in the slide presentation are modeling percentages, not actual percentages of reduction. The second point was a question, and that is, are the 40 acres of seasonal fencing that was just put up going to be planted?
Okay, those are your two questions. Any other statements?
No, I do have another. Would grading in front of the 48 acres Fore Dune project impact sand transport or the volume of sand being measured in the 48 acres? Because I understand grading is happening now in front of the project. And then the last question is, I'm a Napomo Mesa resident. The plume is visible. I live near the CDF site. So if 50% is shown in the modeling and Gary says we've knocked down the peaks, how come the plume is still visible? How come it looks just like it did a year ago? That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll get back to you on that, and then we're going to go to the next. Actually, I think that's the last one. I have a hand up, and it has gone down. So I'm going to wait here a second. There's a Kimberlina Wetham, and we'll take you out. You have 3 minutes, Kimberlina.
Thank you so much for your time. My name's Kimberlina Wetham. I am an OHV commissioner, but I am speaking as a private citizen. Want to thank everybody for their hard work, and I've coordinated a lot with the SAG team and Jack Gillies, and they've been very accommodating with a lot of my pestering requests. I just recently had a tour. I think I was out there about a week and a half ago on a pretty dusty day. And I just have a couple of questions I'd like to put out there on the record that I'd love to see responded to. The first question is, has the SAG determined the contribution of dust from OHV riding over the last 10 years of analysis? If so, what is the delta increase? Part B of that question, Gary Willey stated that there are differences between areas that have had riding use versus areas without riding. What is that actual difference? My second question is, what is the correlation between mass emissions and overall improved air quality? Third, during the report, if I understood correctly, the SAG reported that there is a 1-to-1 dust production reduction relationship, which makes it clear, to me anyhow, that OHV activity is actually irrelevant to the forecasted goals, since there are now no longer hotspots. The 1-to-1 dust production reduction relationship shows that we now have what I hope are some more flexibility, if you will, and achievable, meaningful reductions of PM10 emissions at the Mesa. And I'd like to find out if the SAG is analyzing placing saltation dust reduction mitigations on the open dune sand sheets closest to the Mesa to achieve the greatest bang for our buck. And then my final question is, what are the enforcement mechanisms if there are exceedances
of the state's PM10 standards. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Waiting to see if there's any other hands that come up on this public comment. Seeing none, we're going to go ahead and go forward and close public comment. And Gary, because we're now at 3 hours and 5 minutes here, I think what we'll have to do is get back to these folks with the answers to their questions. And we'll go forward with that. So this is a receive and file for the Scientific Advisory Group presentation. So consider it received and filed for the board here, and we'll move on to the next item, which is board member items. So if there is any board members, please raise your hand and I will announce you if you have any board member items that need to be discussed before we go to our closed session. Seeing none, I don't see anybody with a raised hand, so we're going from the board. So we're going to close the board member items and go to a closed session. Jeff Minery, do you have a time frame? And please don't say 2 hours for the closed session.
The first matter, item A, should be fairly short, and item B is up to your board and your APCO as far as how long that will take. So I would say 20 minutes.
Okay, 20 minutes. So we'll do a 20 minutes and then we have to report back out, Jeff, correct?
Yes, sir. And we could report out. I'm not sure of the technology. Listen, I did discuss that, how we report out, but we will do it one way or another. But I suggest you take public comment before we go to
we will
for that item. Thank you.
Report out. So is there any public comment from the attendees on the closed session, the 2 items? If you would like to, raise your hand on Zoom here and we will call on you if you have any discussion on the closed session items. I see none, so we are going to close public comment on the closed session items, and we're going to go for a 20-minute closed session, and then we'll report out afterwards.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to say that it is at this time that we kindly ask any members of the public, as well as any panelists that are no longer presenting, to please leave the webinar. We will be terminating the live stream and pausing the recording at this time. When we reconvene after closed session, we will resume recording for the report out and then post this record the entire board meeting to our website immediately thereafter. So the report out will be available on our website shortly after adjournment of this meeting, but the live stream will not reinstate after we reconvene after closed session.
Thank you.
So if you'll give me a minute, I will remove any attendees that remain that don't remove themselves, and then I will also pause the recordings.
You got it. We'll wait.
Thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead.